Gunfire cracks across the beaches of northern France. Columns of smoke rise as the German army closes in, tanks grinding forward while trapped British and French soldiers dig shallow trenches in the sand. Overhead, Stuka dive bombers scream down, unleashing chaos. Yet in the middle of this inferno, a desperate mission begins, a race against time to save an entire army. Welcome to the Battle of Dunkirk, a story of courage, survival, and the miracle of evacuation that changed the course of World War II. Before we dive in, let me ask you, where are you tuning in from and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing just how far across the world our history family stretches. And if you're new here, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another epic WW2 story told from start to finish. Now, let's step onto the sands of Dunkirk, 1940. The year was 1939, and Europe, still scarred by the devastation of the First World War, found itself once again on the path to catastrophe. The promises of peace that had been written into the Treaty of Versailles now lay in ruins, and the fragile optimism of the interwar years had given way to fear, suspicion, and the rise of extremist ideologies. At the center of this gathering storm stood Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany, whose vision of conquest, racial supremacy, and territorial expansion threatened to plunge the continent back into chaos. On September 1st, 1939, the world awoke to the sound of thunder, but it was not the thunder of nature. It was the roar of German tanks and the scream of dive bombers descending upon Poland. Hitler's armies unleashed a new form of warfare the world had never seen before, Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Combining overwhelming speed, armoured divisions, and relentless airstrikes, the German Wehrmacht smashed through Polish defences with terrifying efficiency. Villages were burned, cities bombed, and columns of terrified refugees clogged the roads as the Nazi war machine rolled ever forward. The response from Europe's great powers was swift, at least in words. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, honouring their pledges to defend Poland. Yet their declarations rang hollow, for no immediate aid reached the Poles. Instead, the West settled into a period of inaction that would later be called the Phony War. Behind the front lines, soldiers waited in trenches, while the people of Britain prepared for air raids, blackouts, and the possibility of invasion. For Poland, however, there would be no reprieve. By the middle of September, a second aggressor struck from the east, the Soviet Union. Acting under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin's Red Army invaded Poland, ensuring its swift dismemberment. Within weeks, the proud nation was erased from the map, its territory carved up between two of the most brutal regimes in history. The conquest was merciless. Tens of thousands of Polish officers, intellectuals, and civilians were rounded up, deported, or executed in what would later be known as the Katyn Massacre and other atrocities. But Hitler was not satisfied with Poland. He looked northward to Scandinavia, whose icy ports and vital resources were essential to the German war effort. In April 1940, the Nazis launched Operation Weserübung, striking simultaneously at Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a single day, its tiny army overwhelmed by German armour and air power. Norway, however, proved more difficult. The Germans sought to secure the port of Narvik and the flow of Swedish iron ore, vital for their steel production. British and French forces rushed to aid the Norwegians, landing troops along the rugged coast. Fierce battles raged in the fjords where British destroyers clashed with German ships in icy waters. But despite moments of resistance, the Germans prevailed, their paratroopers and mountain troops seizing control of Norway after weeks of fighting. The fall of Norway revealed not only Hitler's boldness but also the weaknesses of the Allies. Britain and France had been slow to act, indecisive in their leadership, and clumsy in their coordination. The German victories emboldened Hitler and cemented his belief that his enemies were weak, divided, and unprepared for the ferocity of the war he was determined to wage. By the spring of 1940, Europe trembled beneath the shadow of Nazi power. With Poland destroyed and Scandinavia subdued, Hitler turned his eyes toward the West. The fate of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands hung in the balance. Ordinary people across Europe braced themselves for what seemed inevitable. Blackout curtains were drawn in London. French soldiers patrolled the Maginot Line. Refugees fled before armies that had not yet arrived. And through it all, the world waited for the next blow of the storm. The stage was set. The gathering clouds of war had broken into lightning strikes, and soon the hurricane of conflict would sweep across Western Europe. Dunkirk, the word that would one day become a legend of survival, was not yet on the horizon, but the forces that would shape its destiny were already in motion. The spring of 1940 brought with it a storm unlike anything Europe had ever seen before. The German war machine, tested and perfected in the crucible of Poland, now turned westward with terrifying speed and ferocity. Hitler's generals had studied their enemies carefully, and they knew that France and Britain were expecting a replay of the Great War. The Allies believed that Germany would again crash against the fortified Maginot Line, a massive belt of concrete bunkers, artillery casemates, and underground tunnels stretching along France's eastern border. But the German High Command had something very different in mind. The plan, crafted by General Erich von Manstein and executed with ruthless precision, called for a gamble so bold that many in the Wehrmacht doubted it would succeed. Instead of attacking head-on, the Germans would strike through the Ardennes forest, a region of thick woods, rolling hills and narrow roads. The Allies had dismissed the Ardennes as impassable for large armoured formations. Heavy tanks, they reasoned, could never navigate its twisting lanes and fragile bridges. But in that underestimation lay their undoing. For the Germans, the Ardennes was not a barrier, but a highway to victory. On May 10, 1940, the storm broke. German forces surged across Luxembourg, Belgium and the Netherlands. The northern thrust was a diversion meant to lure the bulk of the Allied armies into Belgium, far from the true point of decision. French and British commanders, convinced that this was the main assault, rushed forward, eager to repeat the success of 1914 when the Battle of the Marne had saved Paris. They moved their best units, armoured divisions and elite infantry, into Belgium, but as they advanced, the real danger was already unfolding further south. Through the narrow, twisting paths of the Ardennes, the German panzers rumbled forward. The sound of their engines echoed off the wooded hillsides as endless columns of armoured vehicles and supply trucks snaked through the forests. Local civilians watched in disbelief as thousands of tanks and vehicles passed, seemingly without end. The march was grueling. Bridges collapsed under the weight of armour, bottlenecks stretched for miles, and soldiers spent sleepless nights clearing obstacles. Yet discipline and planning held the advance together. Within days, German spearheads reached the Meuse River near the town of Sedan. Here lay the true test of the Blitzkrieg. If the Germans could cross the Meuse and punch through French defences, the road to the Channel coast would lie open. The French believed their defensive positions at Sedan were impregnable. Concrete bunkers lined the river, artillery batteries stood ready, and infantry units waited to repel any attempt at crossing. But the German High Command unleashed a devastating weapon: coordinated air power. On May 13th, waves of Stuka dive bombers screamed out of the sky, their sirens shrieking in a chilling wail designed to unnerve defenders. Bombs slammed into French positions, shattering bunkers, cutting communication lines, and throwing entire units into chaos. The riverbank became a storm of smoke, fire, and shattered earth. French troops, many of them reservists untested in battle, were paralysed by the onslaught. The constant roar of explosions, the terrifying scream of dive bombers, and the choking clouds of dust left them stunned and unable to resist effectively. Under this cover, German engineers quickly threw pontoon bridges across the Meuse. Rubber boats ferried troops across, while tanks swam through on makeshift rafts. Within hours, bridgeheads had been established, and German infantry pressed forward with unrelenting determination. The French artillery, overwhelmed and disorganized, responded too slowly. By the evening of May 13th, German armor had crossed in force. General Heinz Guderian, master of armored warfare, urged his panzers to push relentlessly west, deeper into the heart of France. What followed was a display of speed and coordination that stunned the world. The German panzers did not pause to secure every pocket of resistance. Instead, they bypassed strongholds, leaving slower infantry divisions to mop them up later. Tanks surged forward day and night, supported by motorized infantry and constant air cover. The French defensive system, designed for a slower war of attrition, simply could not cope with this lightning advance. Communication broke down, reserves were misdirected, and panic spread through French ranks as the realization set in. The enemy had not come where they were expected. By May 15th, German forces had torn a gaping hole in the French defenses. French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, shocked by reports from the front, famously called Winston Churchill in desperation, declaring, "We are defeated, we have lost the battle." The speed of the German advance left the Allies reeling. British and French units, still engaged in Belgium, suddenly found themselves outflanked, their lines of supply and retreat threatened. The Maginot Line, the pride of France, had been rendered irrelevant in just a matter of days. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had lived up to its name. In a span of less than a week, Germany had achieved what had seemed impossible. They had bypassed the strongest fortifications in Europe and driven deep into Allied territory. The road to the Channel and to Dunkirk now lay open. The collapse of Belgium in May 1940 unfolded as both a tragedy of circumstance and a crisis of leadership. Belgium, a small but strategically vital nation, had declared its neutrality at the outbreak of war, hoping to avoid the devastation of another German invasion like the one endured in 1914. King Leopold III, a young monarch shouldering immense responsibility, believed that neutrality would shield his people from catastrophe. But Hitler's war machine was relentless, and the German High Command had no intention of honouring Belgian sovereignty. On the 10th of May, German paratroopers and infantry surged across the border, seizing critical bridges, cutting communications, and overwhelming defensive positions before the Belgian army could fully mobilize. The nation that had hoped for peace was thrust violently into the center of Europe's most ferocious battle. The Belgian army, numbering some 600,000 men, was far from insignificant. It was equipped with modern fortifications along the Albert Canal and the mighty fortress complex of Eben Emael, which was believed to be impregnable. Yet in the opening hours of the invasion, German glider troops landed directly atop Eben Emael, deploying hollow charges that ripped through steel and concrete. In less than 24 hours, one of Europe's strongest defensive bastions had fallen. This shocking defeat shattered Belgian morale and stunned Allied planners. What had been expected to hold for weeks crumbled in a single day, opening the gateway for German forces to flood deeper into Belgium. The French and British, honouring their guarantees to Belgium, rushed to her aid. The British Expeditionary Force, under Lord Gort and French First Army, advanced into Belgian territory, setting up a defensive line along the River Dyle. The strategy was sound on paper: stop the Germans in Belgium away from French soil and protect the industrial heartlands of northern France. But this move played directly into Hitler's trap. The Wehrmacht's feint toward Belgium and Holland drew the Allies northward, while the true hammer blow was falling further south through the supposedly impassable Ardennes. For the Belgian army, the days that followed were a desperate struggle for survival. Facing overwhelming German firepower and the constant menace of the Luftwaffe overhead, Belgian soldiers fought with courage, often in isolation. Towns and villages became battlefields, their streets echoing with the thunder of artillery and the crack of rifles. Civilians fled in vast columns, clogging the roads with carts, bicycles, and whatever belongings they could carry. Refugees and retreating troops mixed in a chaotic flow, vulnerable to German strafing runs that turned highways into killing grounds. King Leopold III found himself in an agonizing position. His government, led by Prime Minister Hubert Pirlo, urged him to retreat alongside the Allies and continue the fight from exile. But Leopold, bound by his oath as Commander-in-Chief, refused to abandon his army. He insisted on sharing the fate of his soldiers and his people, even as the front collapsed. This decision would later make him one of the most controversial figures of the war. Some would praise his loyalty to his nation's suffering, while others would condemn him for capitulation and accuse him of undermining the Allied cause. As German forces pressed relentlessly forward, the Belgian line buckled. By the third week of May, the Allies' position was becoming untenable. The German breakthrough in the Ardennes had already severed communications and threatened to encircle the entire Allied force. The French and British were compelled to fall back toward the coast, dragging the exhausted Belgian army with them. Fighting rearguard actions, Belgian units delayed the German advance at tremendous cost, buying precious hours for their allies. On May 27th, the situation reached its breaking point. Cut off, battered, and out of ammunition, King Leopold announced Belgium's surrender. To the Allies, still fighting desperately around Dunkirk, this came as a shocking blow. Winston Churchill was furious, declaring that Leopold had betrayed the common cause. To many Belgians, however, the king's surrender was seen as an act of compassion, sparing his people from further bloodshed in a war they could no longer win. Yet in Britain and France, the decision was viewed as a disaster that endangered the escape of the Allied armies. The fall of Belgium was more than a military defeat. It was a symbol of how swiftly Hitler's Blitzkrieg could topple nations, no matter their courage or preparation. For the Allies, it was a bitter reminder that the war in the West had only just begun, and already they were on the brink of catastrophe. For King Leopold, it marked the beginning of years of exile within his own country, trapped between the wrath of his allies and the suffering of his people under German occupation. Belgium's collapse was the tightening of the noose around the Allied armies, and as the Belgian defences gave way, the path to Dunkirk was opening, a path that would soon become the site of one of history's most desperate evacuations. The town of Sedan, nestled on the banks of the River Meuse in northeastern France, would become the fulcrum of Hitler's great gamble. In May 1940, as the German invasion of France unfolded with frightening speed, Sedan transformed from a quiet French garrison town into the crucible of a battle that would decide the fate of Western Europe. It was here that General Heinz Guderian, the architect of armoured thrusts and blitzkrieg momentum, would unleash his panzers in a daring manoeuvre that stunned the Allies, split their forces, and sent shockwaves across the continent. The story of Sedan is one of audacity, calculated risk, and the tragic unravelling of Allied defences under the weight of German speed and firepower. The French High Command had believed the Ardennes forest to be an impenetrable natural barrier, a stretch of thick woodlands and winding roads that could not support the mass movement of armoured divisions. Their faith in this geography was deep and misplaced. While the French and British braced themselves for an expected German assault through Belgium, the so-called sickle cut, Hitler's true hammer was poised in the Ardennes. Behind the cover of trees and ridgelines, columns of German armour, artillery and mechanised infantry crawled forward in near silence, guided by strict discipline and an unforgiving timetable. The French had left the area thinly defended, assuming nature itself would guard the Meuse crossings. In reality, the forest concealed the steel avalanche that was about to descend. On May 12, 1940, the Germans struck. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps surged towards Sedan, spearheaded by swarms of panzers that seemed to materialize out of the forest itself. The assault was orchestrated with precision. Dive bombers of the Luftwaffe screamed overhead, unleashing a torrent of Stuka sirens and high-explosive bombs that shattered French morale before the tanks even arrived. French troops on the Meuse River, many of them poorly equipped reservists, found themselves paralyzed under the aerial onslaught. Trenches collapsed, bridges splintered, and communication lines were cut in a matter of hours. It was not merely the destruction of positions, but the psychological terror that proved decisive. Men who had never experienced such concentrated bombing fled their posts, leaving gaps in the defense at the very moment discipline was most needed. The German engineers wasted no time. Under covering fire from machine guns and artillery, pontoon bridges were thrown across the Meuse. By nightfall on May the 13th, panzers rumbled across the river, establishing bridgeheads that would prove impossible to dislodge. The French commanders hesitated, debating counterattacks that never came in force. Orders were delayed, reinforcements misdirected, and precious hours were squandered while the Germans expanded their foothold. Guderian, always aggressive, pressed forward relentlessly, urging his armoured spearheads deeper into French territory, determined to maintain momentum before the Allies could regroup. For the French army, the consequences were catastrophic. The breakthrough at Sedan ripped open the Allied front, slicing through the seam between the northern armies fighting in Belgium and the southern French forces tied down along the Maginot Line. The British Expeditionary Force, committed to aiding Belgium, suddenly found its right flank exposed and its supply lines threatened. The Germans had executed the perfect pincer, driving westward with a speed that stunned their adversaries, cutting off entire armies from retreat. The once proud Maginot Line, stretching east along the German frontier, was rendered strategically irrelevant, bypassed in a matter of days by tanks racing across open country. By May 15th, the situation was spiralling into disaster. French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud telephoned British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, his voice trembling as he delivered the grim news. "We are defeated. We have lost the battle." Churchill, shocked by the defeatist tone, pressed him for clarification. Reynaud explained that the Germans had broken through at Sedan, that armoured columns were driving into the heart of France, and that nothing seemed capable of stopping them. It was not just a tactical setback, it was the collapse of the French strategy, the unravelling of their faith in fortifications, and the dawning realisation that the German Blitzkrieg was not a bluff, but a new kind of war altogether. In the days that followed, Guderian's panzers poured through the gap, driving with astonishing speed toward the English Channel. The Allies, trapped in Belgium, faced the terrifying prospect of encirclement. At Sedan, the Germans had not simply won a battle, they had broken the back of French resistance and set into motion the chain of events that would lead to Dunkirk. The crossing of the Meuse was the hinge upon which the campaign turned, the moment when Allied confidence crumbled and German victory seemed inevitable. Sedan would be remembered not only as a battlefield, but as a symbol of hubris and miscalculation. The French belief in natural barriers, the reliance on static defences, and the underestimation of German innovation all converged in a single catastrophe. For the Allies, the road ahead would lead not to victory, but to retreat, desperation, and the desperate struggle for survival on the beaches of Dunkirk. The breakthrough at Sedan had been decisive, and its consequences were swift and catastrophic. Within days of Guderian's armoured spearhead crashing through the French lines, the British Expeditionary Force, the proud professional army of Britain, found itself in a position no commander had foreseen when the war began. What had once been a confident deployment into Belgium now became a desperate flight toward the Channel coast, a retreat that would decide the fate of nations. The retreat was not a single orderly withdrawal, but a chaotic, desperate movement of men and machines stretched across roads choked with vehicles, carts, and frightened civilians. Entire towns emptied as families tried to flee the German advance, their worldly possessions piled onto wagons pulled by horses or even by hand. Intermixed with these desperate civilians marched the soldiers of the Allied armies, their boots worn from days of fighting and retreating, their faces caked with exhaustion and disbelief. The mighty armies of Britain and France, once thought invincible behind modern defences, were being driven back like hunted prey. For the men of the BEF, commanded by General Lord Gort, the situation was stark. The German thrust to the Channel had cut them off from the bulk of the French army to the south. The Allies were divided, fragmented, their communication lines shredded by rapid German movement. The men could feel the noose tightening with every passing day. Each road they marched down seemed to lead not towards salvation, but into a narrowing pocket of doom. On the roads, the retreat turned into a grim theatre of survival. Columns of weary infantry trudged alongside convoys of trucks and artillery, many of them abandoned when fuel ran dry. Men who had trained for disciplined battle now found themselves digging in hastily at crossroads, then falling back again after mere hours fighting skirmishes with advancing German patrols. Every village became a temporary strongpoint, every hedgerow a line of defence. Yet for all their bravery, the sense of inevitability weighed heavy. This was not a fight they could win here. The Luftwaffe was ever present overhead. Dive bombers shrieked down upon the columns, scattering soldiers and civilians alike in explosions of dust and flame. Bridges were obliterated, convoys set alight, and marching units broken apart in terrifying chaos. Survivors pressed on, pulling their wounded comrades along, knowing that halting meant capture or death. To retreat under the constant eye of the enemy's aircraft was to experience a kind of torment few could describe, the feeling that nowhere was safe, not for a moment. Amid this chaos, discipline strained but did not break entirely. British officers barked orders, herding their men back toward the shrinking perimeter. Units that had fought with ferocity in Belgium regrouped as best they could, forming rearguards to cover the retreat. The French too, though battered and betrayed by the speed of the German assault, fought bravely to stem the tide. At Arras, a counterattack even briefly threatened to stall the German advance, giving a flicker of hope before fading under the relentless armoured onslaught. For the soldiers in retreat, however, hope was a rare commodity. Letters written in haste and diaries scribbled on scraps of paper capture the mood. Men who wondered whether they would ever see home again, who questioned if their army would even survive the week. Their retreat was not only physical but psychological, from pride and certainty into doubt and despair. Yet within this dark march lay the seed of endurance. Though retreating, the BEF had not collapsed. Though battered, it had not surrendered. Lord Gort and his commanders understood that salvation might yet be possible, but only if they could hold long enough to reach the ports along the Channel coast. There, ships might carry the men back to Britain. There, on those narrow beaches, history might still grant them a chance. The retreat without hope was, in truth, a retreat toward destiny. Behind the lines of tired men and battered vehicles, behind the shattered villages and burning fields of France, a story was unfolding that would soon become one of the most extraordinary in all of military history. The British Expeditionary Force was running, but it was running toward Dunkirk. The retreat of the British and French armies was not occurring in a vacuum. It unfolded beneath the relentless shadow of a German strategy that was as daring as it was devastating. Having smashed through the Ardennes and rolled across the French countryside with shocking speed, the German armoured divisions, sleek steel formations of panzers, half-tracks and mechanized infantry, now drove inexorably toward the Channel coast. Their objective was clear and chilling: to reach the sea and cut off the Allied armies in Belgium and northern France, trapping them in a vast pocket from which escape would be impossible. This advance was not random chaos, but the deliberate execution of a new kind of warfare, Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. German commanders like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel directed their armoured spearheads with astonishing precision. Rather than engaging in slow, grinding battles of attrition, the panzers bypassed strongpoints, circumvented fortifications, and plunged deep into the open countryside, where speed and surprise were their greatest weapons. To the soldiers on the ground, the appearance of these armoured columns was almost spectral. One moment the countryside was calm, dotted with farms and hedgerows. The next, the thunder of engines and the clatter of treads heralded an unstoppable tide of iron. The French High Command struggled to comprehend the scale and speed of the disaster. Days earlier they had believed the Maginot Line, with its massive fortresses and interlocking fields of fire, was unassailable. Now, the Germans had sidestepped it entirely, driving with frightening momentum across northern France. Their tanks roared down country lanes, cut across open fields, and surged into towns before defenders even knew they were coming. It was as if France itself was unraveling in real time, its defences reduced to scattered pockets of resistance overwhelmed by armoured thrusts. For the British Expeditionary Force, the news was grim. Reports filtered in that the Germans had already crossed the Somme and were racing toward Abbeville. If they reached the Channel coast, they would sever the BEF from the rest of the French army to the south. The implications were catastrophic. Nearly 500,000 Allied soldiers, British, French, and Belgian, would be encircled, cut off from supply, reinforcement, or escape. The retreat that had seemed merely desperate now took on the character of impending annihilation. German units advanced with terrifying coordination. Motorized infantry followed closely behind the tanks, fanning out to secure roads, bridges, and rail lines. Stukas, the dreaded Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, screamed overhead, their sirens wailing as they dove upon columns of retreating soldiers and streams of refugees. Bridges over rivers were destroyed before retreating units could cross, forcing them to abandon vehicles and artillery. Roads became littered with the burned-out husks of trucks, overturned carts, and the belongings of civilians who had fled in panic. The land itself became a graveyard of movement, evidence of the swiftness with which the German advance devoured everything before it. In many villages, local populations awoke to find German tanks already rolling through the streets. The advance so rapid it seemed to outpace the very rhythm of war. Resistance was often brief and tragic. Small groups of French soldiers armed with antiquated anti-tank guns or rifles tried to slow the armoured columns, only to be swept aside by concentrated fire. Rearguards of the BF made courageous last stands in hedgerows and barns, buying precious hours for their comrades further west. Yet each stand ended the same: surrounded, outgunned, overwhelmed. The German juggernaut never paused for long. It pressed forward like a predator, sensing that its prey was almost within its grasp. By May 20, 1940, the leading elements of Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps, had reached the town of Abbeville and beyond it the Channel coast. The sight of the sea, grey, windswept, stretching endlessly toward Britain, signified not relief but triumph for the Germans. The advance had been so fast, so audacious, that many Allied commanders simply refused to believe the reports. But it was true. In just days, the Germans had cut the Allied armies off, driving a steel wedge between the BF in the north and the French forces still struggling in the south. The noose had been closed. For the British and French soldiers still retreating through Belgium and northern France, the reality of their situation now became painfully clear. They were trapped in a vast pocket stretching from the coast inland toward Lille and Arras. Every path southward was barred by German tanks, and every day the circle tightened. Their only chance of survival lay not in breaking through to join the rest of the French army, but in holding long enough to escape by sea, a plan that few dared whisper aloud, for it seemed more fantasy than possibility. Yet even as despair took root, the soldiers did not abandon their fight. French units fought tooth and nail in desperate counterattacks to slow the German advance. British forces prepared defensive lines around key towns, determined to hold the corridor open to the ports. But every man who marched westward knew he was retreating toward the edge of a trap. The Germans had reached the sea, and the fate of the Allied armies now hung by the thinnest of threads. The closing of the noose was one of history's most dramatic manoeuvres, executed with breathtaking speed and ruthless efficiency. It was a triumph of strategy for the Germans and a calamity for the Allies. Yet within this calamity, within the tightening jaws of encirclement, a story was beginning to unfold that would test the endurance of nations and the resolve of men. The stage was set for Dunkirk. The collapse of Belgium and the stunning German advance through the Ardennes had left the Allies in a state of shock. In Paris and London, the highest councils of government were gripped by confusion and desperation. At the centre of this chaos stood two towering figures of the Allied cause: General Maxime Weygand, the newly appointed French commander-in-chief, and Winston Churchill, Britain's newly minted Prime Minister. Both men, separated by background, temperament and vision, now found themselves bound together by the fate of their armies trapped in northern France. Weygand had been called out of retirement after the dismissal of General Maurice Gamelin, the architect of France's failed defensive plan. At 73, Weygand carried the gravitas of a veteran soldier, once aide-de-camp to Marshal Foch in the final days of the First World War. His reputation was one of strict discipline and clear, uncompromising analysis. Yet when he surveyed the battlefield in May 1940, he found a situation bordering on catastrophe. The German panzers had torn a gaping wound through the French front at Sedan, thrusting westward with such speed that entire armies were now cut off. Across the Channel, Churchill had been Prime Minister for only 2 weeks, and already the weight of history bore heavily upon him. He had inherited a disaster in the making, yet his fierce determination to resist German domination was unshaken. He flew repeatedly to Paris, meeting with Weygand and French Premier Paul Reynaud in desperate councils of war. These meetings revealed not only the peril of the battlefield, but also the widening cracks in the Allied alliance. The central debate revolved around strategy. Weygand insisted on what became known as the Weygand Plan, a counterattack from both north and south to pinch off the German spearhead and reconnect the severed French and British armies. It was a bold idea on paper, but it required coordination, speed, and fresh reserves, resources that the Allies no longer possessed. The British Expeditionary Force, exhausted and retreating, had little appetite for offensive action. Many of its commanders were already contemplating withdrawal toward the Channel ports. Churchill, however, desperate to keep France in the fight, pressed his generals to cooperate with Weygand's scheme. He feared that any hint of abandonment would fracture the fragile Franco-British alliance. The discussions grew tense. Weygand, proud and unyielding, bristled at British hesitation. Churchill, equally stubborn, refused to concede that Britain's lifeline, the survival of the BEF, should be risked in futile counterstrokes. At times, their exchanges bordered on open confrontation. Behind closed doors, French leaders accused the British of preparing to sacrifice France in order to save themselves. Meanwhile, British officers quietly warned Churchill that remaining tied to Weygand's offensive vision could mean the destruction of the BEF. While political leaders debated, events at the front were moving too fast. German armoured divisions under Guderian and Rommel were already racing to the Channel coast, closing the trap around Dunkirk. The narrow window for Weygand's counterattack was slipping away with every passing hour. Yet in Paris, hopes persisted that with Churchill's support, a grand manoeuvre could still restore the front. For Churchill, these meetings were defining moments. He left Paris with a profound sense of unease, recognizing that France's will to resist was weakening, even as its leaders demanded greater sacrifice from Britain. The seeds of mutual distrust were sown. France needed immediate miracles. Britain needed time and survival. The gap between those priorities was widening irreparably. The councils of May 1940 revealed not only the collapse of strategy, but also the deep human struggles of alliance warfare. Leadership under pressure became a clash of personalities, of national interests, of diverging visions for survival. Weygand and Churchill, two men of immense stature, were ultimately powerless to halt the tide of German conquest. Their plans and arguments, their appeals and counter-arguments were overtaken by the relentless momentum of the Blitzkrieg. And as their voices echoed in the conference halls of Paris, the roar of German tanks grew louder, drawing ever closer to the Channel. The fate of the Allied armies and the future of Western Europe was being decided not in the chambers of strategy, but on the fields and roads where men were retreating, desperate to escape the tightening noose. As the German panzers thundered westward in late May 1940, their tracks carved a black scar across the map of France. Entire Allied armies had been thrown into disarray. French divisions were collapsing under the pressure, while the British Expeditionary Force, battered and retreating, clung desperately to narrow roads leading toward the Channel ports. By the 23rd of May, German armoured spearheads had reached the sea at Abbeville, severing the Allies in Belgium from their comrades in the south. It appeared that the trap had snapped shut. Only one final push was needed to crush the encircled British and French troops. And yet, at the very moment of near-total victory, a decision emerged from Adolf Hitler himself that stunned his generals and baffled historians ever since: the order to halt. The halt order, as it became known, remains one of the most mysterious pauses in modern warfare. The panzer divisions, those swift and relentless instruments of Blitzkrieg, were commanded to stop short of Dunkirk. For 2 full days their momentum was checked, their engines idled, and their crews, who had driven hundreds of miles in a lightning advance, now waited restlessly in the fields of Flanders. The delay granted the Allies a gift beyond measure: time. Time to regroup, time to strengthen defensive lines, time to prepare for evacuation. Without this pause, it is almost certain that the encircled armies would have been annihilated. But why did Hitler order such a halt at the edge of triumph? The explanations are layered in complexity. Some point to the terrain. The marshes and canals surrounding Dunkirk were treacherous ground for tanks, which risked bogging down in soft earth and narrow lanes. Hitler, still haunted by the quagmire of the First World War, feared that his panzers might become trapped in unsuitable terrain and cut off by desperate Allied counterattacks. He preferred to let Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe finish the job from the air, hammering Dunkirk into submission with bombs and fire. Others argue that the pause reflected a deeper hesitation within Hitler's own mind. He revered the armoured forces as the jewel of his army, reluctant to risk their destruction in what he perceived might become a costly slog near the coast. His senior commanders, particularly General Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal von Kluge, reinforced these fears. Both urged caution, insisting that the exhausted tanks needed rest, repairs, and consolidation of supply lines. For once, Hitler listened. There is also the shadow of politics. Some historians suggest that Hitler's halt carried a strategic purpose beyond the battlefield. He harboured fantasies of driving Britain out of the war, not through total annihilation of its army, but through negotiation. By allowing a large portion of the British Expeditionary Force to escape, he may have hoped to signal magnanimity, offering Britain an honourable withdrawal, paving the way for peace talks and preserving Germany's freedom to turn east against the Soviet Union. If this was his intent, it proved a catastrophic miscalculation. The German panzer commanders themselves were furious. Men like General Heinz Guderian, the architect of armoured warfare, could scarcely contain their disbelief. Victory lay within their grasp, yet their hands were forced to unclench. Guderian and his colleagues argued vehemently that the tanks should drive on, break into Dunkirk, and crush the encircled armies before they could escape. But their protests were overruled. The order stood firm: halt. And so, as the German armoured columns lingered, the Allies seized the chance to build defences around the shrinking perimeter of Dunkirk. British engineers laid mines, dug trenches and manned improvised strongpoints, while soldiers who had been scattered and demoralised only days earlier now reformed under a single purpose: survival. The beaches began to fill with men awaiting evacuation, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that the panzers had stopped just beyond the horizon. The halt order was not a pause of hours, but of days, crucial days in which the impossible became possible. Churchill, informed of the reprieve, saw at once its significance. A miracle of deliverance, he would later call it. The miracle was born not only of Allied courage and improvisation, but also of Hitler's hesitation. When, at last, the halt order was lifted and the panzers were unleashed again, it was too late. The window had closed, Dunkirk had become a fortress of resistance, and the evacuation was already underway. The tanks that had once been unstoppable now found themselves attacking fortified positions, facing stiff resistance, and moving against time itself. The chance for total destruction had slipped away. The halt order remains one of history's great turning points, a decision in which hubris, caution, and miscalculation converged. What seemed in Hitler's mind to be prudence or even cunning would prove to be one of his greatest strategic blunders. Instead of annihilation, the British army lived to fight another day. Instead of surrender, Britain stood defiant. And from the beaches of Dunkirk, the course of the Second World War began to bend toward a long and bitter struggle that Hitler had never anticipated. Dunkirk. A modest French port city nestled against the grey waters of the English Channel, suddenly transformed into the last fragile lifeline of an entire army. By late May 1940, what had once been a bustling seaside town filled with fishermen, shopkeepers and children playing in narrow streets now lay in the grip of terror and suffocating uncertainty. Refugees trudged in endless columns, pushing carts, carrying bundles of clothes, and clutching children whose eyes were wide with fear. Among them, weary Allied soldiers, some still armed, others stripped of everything but their uniforms, pressed through the same streets, their boots leaving muddy imprints on cobblestones stained with soot and blood. This was no longer a city of life. It was a city under siege, its very existence collapsing inward like a fortress surrounded on all sides. The perimeter around Dunkirk was hastily drawn, a thin defensive ring stretching across towns and canals, manned by exhausted British, French and Belgian units who knew their task was grim: to hold back the relentless German advance just long enough for evacuation to be possible. The defensive line was not a wall of strength, but a fragile barrier, stitched together by fragments of broken divisions, rearguard units, and officers desperately trying to rally men whose faces betrayed exhaustion and despair. They built barricades out of overturned carts, sandbags, and abandoned cars, blocking roads that might soon carry enemy tanks. Soldiers crouched in shallow foxholes, rifles in trembling hands, their ears ringing with the constant thunder of German artillery. Inside Dunkirk itself, chaos reigned. The streets were choked with traffic, military trucks crammed with supplies, civilian carts piled high with possessions, bicycles weaving through panicked crowds. The harbour was a scene of near madness, ships of every size jostling for space, the sharp whistle of incoming shells forcing men and women to dive for cover. Refugees slept on sidewalks and church steps, their meagre belongings clutched tightly, while soldiers, faces blackened with grime, uniforms torn and bloodied, collapsed against walls in exhausted silence. In every corner, fear of encirclement pressed down like a suffocating weight. As the perimeter shrank day by day, Dunkirk's defensive belt became a desperate struggle of attrition. Each town, each bridge, and each canal crossing became a critical node in the defense, fought over with savage intensity. Villages that had been quiet farming communities days earlier were now reduced to ruins, their walls collapsing under the impact of German artillery, their fields scarred by tank tracks and bomb craters. French units fought with a bitter ferocity, determined to buy time for the evacuation even as their homeland fell piece by piece. British regiments too held their ground, often fighting to the last man to delay German spearheads for only a few more precious hours. Overhead, the skies thundered with the roar of the Luftwaffe. Junkers dive bombers plunged with terrifying screams, releasing bombs that tore apart buildings and set fuel depots ablaze. Fires burned across the city, filling the air with black smoke that mixed with the acrid stench of cordite and the sharp tang of seawater. Yet, despite the pounding from above, the perimeter held, fragile, cracking, but not broken. For every German assault that smashed into it, battered Allied units countered with what strength they had left, retreating only when survival was impossible, then reforming another line just a few miles closer to the sea. For the civilians trapped within Dunkirk, the ordeal was nearly unbearable. Families huddled in cellars during bombardments, emerging to find their homes reduced to rubble. Mothers tried to hush crying children, fearful that noise would draw attention from marauding aircraft. Streams of refugees, too frightened to stay, but with nowhere left to flee, mingled with Allied troops along the beaches. The once proud city, with its centuries of history, its churches, markets and schools, had become a surreal stage where soldiers and civilians shared the same fate: to endure, to cling to hope, and to wait for deliverance across the waters that glimmered faintly on the horizon. And yet, within this chaos, there was resilience. Soldiers, though worn down by weeks of retreat, still dug trenches, mounted sentries, and prepared firing positions along the edge of the shrinking defensive cordon. French commanders coordinated with British officers, sometimes amid bitter arguments and mutual recriminations, but always returning to the same grim determination: hold the line at all costs. The defence of Dunkirk was not a battle to achieve victory. It was a battle for time, measured in hours and minutes, each one purchased with blood. As night fell over the besieged city, the glow of burning buildings lit the sky in eerie shades of orange and red. The sound of artillery never ceased, echoing across the fields and canals, mingling with the cries of the wounded and the distant thrum of ships preparing at the harbour. The perimeter at Dunkirk was shrinking, but within its fragile embrace lay the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. The British Expeditionary Force, their French allies, and the last hope of escape from annihilation. The city was battered, suffocated and nearly broken, but still, it endured. This was Dunkirk in late May 1940, a city transformed into a crucible of survival, where soldiers and civilians alike clung to life in the face of overwhelming firepower, and where every hour gained on the defensive line would echo through history. For as long as the perimeter held, the chance of salvation remained alive. The situation along the French coast had become untenable. By late May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force, along with thousands of French and Belgian soldiers, found itself pressed into a shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. The roads behind them were clogged with refugees, their carts laden with what little they could save of their lives, and the German advance pressed relentlessly from every direction. The skies were darkened by the ominous drone of Luftwaffe bombers, and artillery thundered ever closer. It was in these desperate hours that the British government turned to an unassuming but deeply experienced naval officer, Vice Admiral Bertram Home Ramsay, to craft a miracle where none seemed possible. Ramsay had spent much of his career in the Royal Navy, away from the spotlight. A man of meticulous preparation and quiet competence, he was not among the most flamboyant figures in the service. Nor was he one who courted attention. Instead, he embodied the kind of steadfast leadership that would prove essential in the days to come. Ramsay worked from the labyrinthine underground tunnels of Dover Castle, a medieval fortress perched above the English Channel. It was here, in these dimly lit chambers filled with maps, telephones and radio equipment, that he and his staff conceived of what would become known as Operation Dynamo, a code name taken from the dynamo room within the castle that powered their command centre. The task before him seemed almost absurd in its ambition. Over 3,500 Allied soldiers were trapped on the French coast, hemmed in by German forces that could at any moment sweep in to annihilate them. Dunkirk itself was no natural port. Its beaches stretched wide and flat, but they were shallow and unsuitable for large warships. The main harbour, once serviceable, had been heavily bombed by the Luftwaffe, its piers shattered and its waters strewn with wreckage. Any plan to extract such a vast number of men across the channel would require ingenuity, speed, and a willingness to embrace extraordinary risk. Ramsay began by surveying the assets at hand. The Royal Navy had already dispatched destroyers and troopships to French waters, but their numbers were far too few to carry out a mass evacuation. Moreover, the shallow beaches of Dunkirk meant these vessels could not come close to shore without grounding themselves. Men would have to wade out into the sea, often under fire, to reach them. The challenge was compounded by the need to move vast numbers swiftly before the German panzers renewed their advance, or the Luftwaffe obliterated the stranded army from above. The only solution lay in improvisation. Ramsay authorized the requisitioning of every available vessel that could make the channel crossing, no matter how small. Merchant ships, ferries, fishing trawlers, paddle steamers, tugs, and even private yachts were called into service. These would become the now famous little ships of Dunkirk, though at the time they were merely a desperate necessity. Ramsay's plan envisioned them ferrying soldiers from the beaches to larger warships waiting offshore, a shuttle service conducted under constant threat of air attack. Every mile of open water would be a gauntlet, and yet it was the only conceivable path. Time was of the essence. Ramsay's orders were drafted with urgency, transmitted to naval commands across Britain. Crews scrambled to ready their ships, many of which were ill-prepared for war. Civilian captains were summoned, sometimes given mere hours to hand over their vessels or to volunteer themselves to sail them. In London, Winston Churchill and the War Cabinet authorised the plan, though expectations were grim. At first, officials hoped perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 men might be saved, enough to preserve the core of Britain's professional army. The rest, it was feared, might have to surrender or be destroyed. Ramsay knew that coordination was everything. From his command post, he established communications with the Royal Air Force, whose Spitfires and Hurricanes would be tasked with providing cover against the Luftwaffe. He coordinated with the French Navy, whose ships would also join in the evacuation, and he worked with the British Army to establish embarkation points along the beaches and at the damaged harbour mole, a long stone breakwater that would prove unexpectedly vital in loading men onto ships. Every detail had to be accounted for: tides, loading times, fuel supplies, and above all the relentless enemy pressure. The plan was as daring as it was fragile. Any breakdown in coordination, any sudden German offensive, or any crippling blow by the Luftwaffe could unravel the operation in hours. And yet, in the dark halls of Dover Castle, Ramsay pressed on, shaping what would become one of the most extraordinary rescue efforts in military history. As the plan took form, across the channel the stranded soldiers still clung to hope amid despair. They saw the distant outline of England across the water, so close and yet impossibly far. For them, salvation lay in the hands of men like Ramsay and the vast armada of ships that were now gathering along the British coast. Operation Dynamo was set in motion. Within hours, the channel would teem with vessels of every shape and size, their mission not to wage war, but to deliver men from annihilation. It was a gamble against time, against the enemy, and against the very limits of human endurance. And yet, as the orders spread and the first ships prepared to sail, the stage was set for an evacuation that would astonish the world. Dunkirk was no longer simply a battle. It was about to become a legend. By late May 1940, the fate of an entire army rested upon the waters of the English Channel. Hundreds of thousands of men were trapped, pressed against the French coast, their backs to the sea, their eyes searching desperately for salvation. The Royal Navy, stretched thin and battered by war's demands, could not shoulder the impossible burden alone. But then, in one of the most extraordinary and moving episodes of the war, help came from an unlikely quarter. An armada was born, not of destroyers and cruisers, but of humble civilian craft summoned from harbours, rivers, and coastal towns across Britain. They would soon become immortalised as the little ships of Dunkirk. The call went out in secrecy, drafted by the Admiralty in tones both urgent and understated. Notices were sent to yacht clubs, fishing cooperatives, ferry companies, and even private owners of small leisure boats. The demand was simple but extraordinary. Britain required every seaworthy vessel that could cross the channel. These boats, most never built for open sea, would become lifelines. They were to ferry soldiers from the shallow beaches where warships could not reach, out to waiting destroyers and transports anchored farther offshore. For some, it was a requisition, an official taking of private property in the name of survival. For others, it was a volunteer's answer to duty. But whatever their origin, these little ships were about to sail into history. They came in all shapes and sizes: fishing trawlers that normally hauled nets heavy with cod and herring, sturdy Thames barges accustomed to hauling coal and timber up and down the river, sleek motor yachts polished and gleaming, the pride of English gentry now pressed into grim necessity. River ferries, pleasure steamers, and even lifeboats were fitted out for service. Their names, often quaint and unassuming, Maid of Honour, Gracie Fields, Tamzine, Sundowner, would become etched into the story of national salvation. Some were powered by strong engines, others by fragile motors prone to failure. A few, astonishingly, would make the voyage under sail. Together they formed a ragtag fleet unlike anything Europe had seen. At the heart of this effort stood not only the Royal Navy, but ordinary civilians, men with little military training, some seasoned seafarers, others weekend sailors whose experience rarely extended beyond calm rivers or placid lakes. Many were not conscripted but volunteered, choosing to risk the Channel's treacherous waters under German fire. There were fathers and sons, fishermen and ferrymen, mechanics and merchants. Their reasons varied: patriotism, duty, the refusal to stand by while young men perished, but their courage was unmistakable. The sight of this flotilla gathering along the southern coast of England was remarkable. From Ramsgate to Dover, from the Medway to the Solent, piers bustled with activity. Boats were fueled, equipped with hastily gathered supplies, and sometimes fitted with makeshift weapons or radios. Some owners, too old to make the crossing themselves, handed their vessels over to naval crews with tears in their eyes, whispering quiet prayers for their safe return. Others insisted on going, unwilling to see their craft and their country go into danger without them. Crossing the Channel was no simple matter. The waters could turn rough in an instant, and the German Luftwaffe prowled the skies with merciless vigilance. Bombers swooped low, strafing beaches and boats alike. Stukas screamed as they dove, their sirens engineered to spread panic. Many small vessels had no armor, no guns, nothing to protect their crews but courage and the hope of survival. Yet they pressed on, guided by instinct, charts, or simply the sight of the smoke rising from Dunkirk on the horizon. Some broke down halfway and had to be towed. Some were sunk outright, swallowed by flame and foam, but more kept coming, wave after wave, the Channel alive with the specks of their hulls. When the little ships finally reached the beaches of Dunkirk, the scene was surreal. Soldiers, weary, hungry, and beaten down by days of retreat and bombardment, waded out into the surf, their boots and uniforms heavy with seawater. Lines of men stood waist-deep, their eyes fixed on the tiny boats that bobbed toward them. For many, it seemed absurd that such fragile vessels could offer salvation. And yet, as they clambered aboard, shoulder to shoulder, drenched and silent, these craft carried them out to the larger warships beyond the surf. Trip after trip, the little ships performed their shuttle duty, bridging the unbridgeable gap between the shore and safety. The stories of individual boats became legendary. The Sundowner, a former motor yacht owned by Charles Lightoller, himself the senior surviving officer of the Titanic, set out from Ramsgate and packed over 100 men aboard, far beyond her intended capacity. Fishing boats like the Tamzine, the smallest vessel known to cross, carried handfuls of men across the waters, proving that even the humblest of craft could alter history. Steamers like the Gracie Fields and the Medway Queen hauled thousands. Many more went unrecorded, their deeds unheralded, their sacrifice known only to those they saved. By the end of Operation Dynamo, nearly 700 civilian vessels had taken part in the rescue, alongside the Royal Navy's warships. Together, they lifted more than 338,000 Allied troops from the jaws of annihilation. But the little ships became something more than a statistic. They became a symbol, the embodiment of Britain's defiance, resilience, and unity in the face of disaster. They showed that when the might of armies and navies faltered, ordinary people armed only with determination and courage could alter the course of war. The Armada of Hope was never meant to be glamorous. It was makeshift, improvised, and perilous, but it succeeded beyond all expectation. In the darkest hour of 1940, when Europe lay under the shadow of conquest, the little ships of Dunkirk shone as flickering beacons of salvation. They carried not only soldiers, but also the spirit of a nation, proving that even the smallest vessel, guided by the hands of ordinary men, could rise to greatness when history demanded it. The beaches of Dunkirk, already choked with men, equipment, and desperation, now became the stage for a new horror. As dawn broke over the channel, the muffled roar of distant engines gave way to a menacing hum that grew louder with every passing second. Soldiers craned their necks skyward, their eyes scanning the horizon, and then they saw them, the black silhouettes of German aircraft cutting across the pale morning sky like predatory birds circling helpless prey. The Luftwaffe had arrived in force. Dive bombers, level bombers, and fighter escorts filled the heavens, their glinting fuselages reflecting the sun as they bore down on Dunkirk. What had once been a fragile hope of rescue now seemed poised to collapse under an iron storm. Leading the charge were the infamous Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, machines designed not only to destroy but to terrorize. As they peeled away from their formations, their wings cut sharp arcs through the air, and their sirens, mechanical Jericho trumpets fixed to their landing gear, screamed with a banshee wail that pierced the hearts of men on the ground. Soldiers froze, clutched the sand, or threw themselves into shallow trenches as the Stukas plummeted earthward, their dive steep and unrelenting. Bombs tumbled from their bellies, whistling as they fell, before erupting in geysers of sand, fire, and steel. Entire patches of beach vanished in fireballs, and with them the men unlucky enough to stand in the blast zones. For those trapped on the ground, there was no escape, only the futile hope that the next bomb would fall somewhere else. Hot on their heels came the Heinkel He-111s, the lumbering workhorses of the Luftwaffe's bomber fleet. Flying in steady formations, they released stick after stick of bombs over the harbour and its surrounding piers. The wooden jetties splintered under the impact, great shards of timber spearing into the air before crashing into the water below. Ships waiting to load soldiers were struck directly, some breaking apart in explosions that sent plumes of black smoke curling high into the sky. Men leapt into the water, their uniforms dragging them under, as burning oil spread across the surface in deadly sheets of fire. The harbour, once the lifeline of the evacuation, was being systematically reduced to ruin, each raid cutting another artery in the fragile escape effort. But perhaps the most terrifying element of the onslaught came from above in the form of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. Sleek, fast, and lethal, they prowled the skies with predatory precision. Their machine guns and cannons raked the beaches, cutting down men who had no cover, no way to defend themselves. Columns of retreating soldiers, lines of men waiting to embark, even small boats crowded with survivors, all became targets. Every burst of fire sent bodies sprawling, every strafing run left trails of blood in the sand. It was a slaughter from the air carried out with cold efficiency. British and French anti-aircraft guns barked back defiantly, their tracers streaking upward. But for every plane hit, dozens more pressed the attack. The air above Dunkirk had become a deadly battlefield. The destruction was not limited to men. Equipment and supplies littered the beaches in heaps, abandoned as soldiers tried to save themselves. Trucks, artillery, and ammunition dumps became magnets for German bombs. One well-placed hit on a fuel depot sent flames roaring skyward, the explosion shaking the earth like an earthquake and sending a pall of black smoke billowing out over the channel. The fire was so immense it could be seen for miles. The Luftwaffe had turned Dunkirk into an inferno, a place where sand, steel, and flesh blended into a single vision of chaos. Every attack seemed to erase more hope, every explosion a grim reminder of the imbalance between German air power and the helpless men below. Amid this chaos, stories of individual terror played out with heart-wrenching clarity. A group of soldiers huddled in the shallow surf, clutching at ropes tied to overloaded boats, when a Stuka's bomb exploded just yards away, throwing men into the air like rag dolls. Others who had finally found passage on a small vessel were strafed by fighters before they even left the harbour, their bodies falling into the sea that was supposed to carry them home. Refugees, too, caught in the maelstrom, fled in terror through the streets of Dunkirk as buildings collapsed around them, crushed under the weight of falling bombs. Civilians and soldiers alike shared in the nightmare, indistinguishable in their suffering. Yet even under this relentless firestorm, there was resilience. British Spitfires and Hurricanes from the Royal Air Force launched daring sorties across the Channel, engaging the Luftwaffe in swirling dogfights above the beaches. For the men on the ground, every time they saw a German plane spiral out of the sky trailing smoke, a cheer went up. Small victories in a sea of despair. But the truth was stark. The RAF was stretched thin, forced to balance the defence of Britain itself with the protection of Dunkirk. Their presence gave hope, but could not erase the grim reality that the Luftwaffe ruled the skies. The Luftwaffe's campaign at Dunkirk was not merely about destruction, it was psychological warfare. The constant drone of engines overhead deprived men of rest. The sudden shriek of diving Stukas sent entire units into panic, and the smoke and fire convinced many that escape was impossible. Every man on those beaches lived under the shadow of death from above, where the open sky offered no safety, only dread. Dunkirk had become a cauldron where men not only fought for survival but wrestled with the crushing weight of fear itself. Still, amid the burning ruins and bomb-blasted sands, the evacuation continued. Every hour bought by the perimeter defences, every boat that braved the inferno, every soldier who made it onto a ship was a small defiance of the Luftwaffe's might. Dunkirk had become a place where steel and fire collided with courage and desperation, where the skies rained death, but where hope, fragile as it was, refused to die. As soldiers huddled on the sand at Dunkirk, staring nervously at the skies for the dreaded scream of Stukas, many cursed what they believed was the absence of the Royal Air Force. From their perspective, the men of the BEF were alone, exposed, bombed and strafed while waiting for salvation. They saw the black silhouettes of German dive bombers hurtling downward, their sirens shrieking, their payloads erupting in fire and sand, and yet rarely did they notice British fighters above. To the infantrymen below, it seemed as though the RAF had abandoned them, but the truth was far different. High above the Channel and the beaches, often invisible to those trapped below, a furious battle raged between British Spitfires, Hurricanes, and the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitts. This hidden war was fought in the thin air of the upper atmosphere, beyond the sight line of the men on the ground, but it was a battle that determined whether Dunkirk could be saved or crushed. The responsibility for covering the evacuation fell upon Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's No. 11 Group of Fighter Command. Park was a man of stern discipline and keen tactical sense, who knew that his fighter squadrons could not be wasted in reckless dogfights. He positioned his aircraft carefully, intercepting incoming raids before they could reach the beaches, while others patrolled the air corridors over the Channel. For every Stuka that descended, there were Hurricanes and Spitfires rising to meet them. The skies filled with twisting duels, engines roaring, machine guns rattling, tracer rounds tearing arcs across the blue. German bombers, slow and lumbering, tried to break through under heavy escort, while RAF pilots darted in and out, striking and vanishing before the Messerschmitts could pin them down. To the men on the beaches, it seemed the German planes came unchallenged. In reality, dozens of them never reached the shore, blown apart miles inland or shot down into the sea by RAF fire. The effort was immense, and the cost was high. During the 9 days of Operation Dynamo, the RAF flew nearly 3,500 sorties, straining both machines and pilots to the breaking point. Squadrons scrambled repeatedly each day, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before being sent back into the fight. Pilots endured exhaustion, their eyes bloodshot, hands trembling from adrenaline and fatigue. Many were young, barely out of their teens, yet they fought with ferocity, knowing that behind them on the beaches were hundreds of thousands of their countrymen. The Luftwaffe, determined to finish the encircled armies, threw in everything it had: Heinkel He 111 bombers, Dornier Do-17s, Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, and swarms of Bf-109 fighters. The skies became a deadly chessboard, where one miscalculation meant spiraling down in flames. And still, to the soldiers waiting below, all this was largely invisible. When a Stuka dive-bombed and exploded near them, they saw only destruction. What they did not see was the RAF patrols intercepting entire bomber formations before they even reached the beaches, turning back wave after wave of attacks. Nor did they see the dogfights that drew German fighters away, preventing them from massacring the evacuation fleet in the Channel. Frustrated and bitter, many soldiers cursed the RAF, unaware that hundreds of their lives were being saved out of sight in the thin, cloud-streaked air. Later, many of these men would apologize once they learned the truth, that without the RAF, Operation Dynamo would have been impossible. The Luftwaffe, though dominant in numbers, failed to achieve air superiority over Dunkirk. Their Stukas proved devastating against stationary targets but were vulnerable to fighter interception. German bomber crews began calling the skies over the Channel the Hell Corridor, where Hurricanes and Spitfires seemed to appear from nowhere, cutting through their formations and scattering them in panic. Even the formidable Bf-109 escorts struggled. They were operating at the edge of their range with limited fuel reserves, forcing them to abandon engagements quickly and turn back to France. RAF fighters operating closer to home could press the attack and return swiftly for another sortie. This imbalance allowed the RAF to maintain a relentless pressure on German operations. The psychological impact of this unseen shield was just as important as the physical one. For every transport ship that slipped back across the Channel, for every column of men that managed to board a vessel without being annihilated, the RAF's intervention had played a hidden role. Pilots themselves were acutely aware of their mission's stakes. Many later recalled flying low over the Channel and catching glimpses of the armada of small boats and destroyers braving artillery fire and air raids. They knew that down there were ordinary civilians and sailors risking everything, and above them it was their responsibility to keep the Luftwaffe at bay. By the end of the evacuation, the RAF had lost over 150 aircraft, a grievous blow at a time when Britain could scarcely afford to spare them. But their sacrifice had bought the time and space for nearly 34,000 men to escape across the Channel. It was a battle largely fought out of sight of those it saved, but one that would go down in history as a decisive act of courage and endurance. The hidden battle above was not simply a supporting action, it was the invisible shield without which Dunkirk would have been a massacre. The men who sat in cockpits, breathing the thin air, fighting until fuel and strength gave out, were as vital to the miracle of Dunkirk as the sailors who braved the waters below. The beaches of Dunkirk, stretching for miles along the northern coast of France, became a vast open-air prison in late May of 1940. Here, tens upon tens of thousands of Allied soldiers, British, French, Belgian, and a scattering of Dutch, were forced to wait in the sand, trapped between the cold waters of the Channel to the north and the advancing German armies to the south. There was no cover, no fortification, no real shelter. Just endless flat shoreline under a pitiless sky where every soldier who stood in line for rescue was exposed, vulnerable, and powerless. The scene was both mesmerizing and nightmarish. A human tide pressed together in lines that snaked across the beach, each man clutching his rifle or kit bag, waiting, hoping, and silently praying for deliverance. The organization of the beach was deceptively simple yet utterly chaotic. Men were herded into long columns, lines of khaki and blue stretching hundreds of yards into the distance, each line forming like a living pipeline that led down to the edge of the surf. The officers did their best to impose order, shouting over the roar of engines and the crash of artillery, trying to maintain discipline even as despair seeped into the ranks. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder for hours, sometimes days, barely moving, barely eating, as the line crawled forward toward the chance of a place on a boat. Some men collapsed from exhaustion or dehydration and were quietly carried aside. Others simply stared at the horizon, eyes fixed on the faint, tantalizing outline of England in the distance, so close, yet impossibly far away. And overhead, death was never far. The low drone of Luftwaffe aircraft was the constant soundtrack to Dunkirk. German bombers, especially the dreaded Stukas, came screaming down in terrifying dives, their sirens wailing like banshees, releasing payloads that tore into the sand and sea with devastating force. The lines of waiting soldiers could do nothing but flatten themselves against the earth, digging shallow hollows with their hands, praying the bombs would miss. The sand erupted into geysers of smoke and flame, bodies hurled into the air by the shockwaves. Yet when the dust settled, the lines reformed as if by instinct, men brushing themselves off and returning to their places, clinging to the one fragile thread of hope, that their turn to board might still come. Refugees mingled with soldiers in this sea of humanity. French civilians, families with children, elderly men and women pushing carts of belongings, were caught in the same bottleneck, desperate to escape the oncoming German tide. Their presence only deepened the sense of chaos and tragedy. Mothers wept as they begged soldiers for a place on the boats. Children cried amid the din of engines and explosions, and the soldiers themselves, trained to fight, not to flee, felt the humiliation of being reduced to waiting helplessly alongside civilians. Dunkirk was not just a battlefield. It was a crucible of survival, where the boundaries between soldier and refugee blurred into one shared desperation. The beaches themselves bore the scars of this ordeal. Abandoned rifles lay half-buried in the sand. Helmets, packs, and ammunition boxes littered the shoreline, discarded by men trying to lighten their loads in the vain hope of swimming out to the ships. Wrecked vehicles smouldered in the dunes, their blackened shells standing as grim monuments to the collapse of France's northern defences. The tide washed in with cruel regularity, carrying the bloated bodies of the drowned back onto the beach, forcing the men to stand in line beside their fallen comrades. Each wave seemed to mock their predicament, reminding them that time, like the sea, was relentless and merciless. And yet, in the middle of this nightmare, there was discipline and quiet courage. Soldiers kept order, even as the lines seemed endless. Officers barked commands, organizing embarkation parties, directing units toward the wooden mole at Dunkirk's harbour, where larger ships could dock. Men marched in silence, heads held high, as though clinging to the last shreds of dignity in the face of catastrophe. Each man knew the odds were against him, that the Luftwaffe could strike at any moment, that the sea could betray them, but still, they stood in their endless lines, waiting with patience born not of optimism, but of necessity. The beaches of Dunkirk became a paradoxical place, a vision of utter despair, yet also a tableau of resilience. For those who were there, the sight was unforgettable. A living, breathing sea of men, thousands upon thousands, stretching from the dunes to the waves, bound together not by victory, but by survival. It was here, on this sand, that the fate of an army, and perhaps of Britain itself, hung in the balance. At Dunkirk, salvation did not come from the beaches alone. Stretching like a fragile finger into the grey waters of the channel stood the East Mole, a wooden breakwater that had never been intended for the mass embarkation of men. Originally constructed to shield the harbour from tides and storms, this long, narrow pier of planks and timbers would become one of the most unlikely lifelines in modern military history. It was not a grand jetty nor a purpose-built dock, it was simply a breakwater where waves slapped against creaking beams and gulls perched idly on the weathered posts. Yet under the pressure of encirclement and with no other choice, this wooden structure would serve as the artery through which hundreds of thousands of soldiers might escape annihilation. It was here, amid the sound of boots clattering on timber and shells crashing in the distance, that the drama of Dunkirk would reach one of its most desperate yet inspiring chapters. As the evacuation began, commanders quickly realized that small boats ferrying men directly from the beaches could never keep pace with the demand. The shallow draft of the sandbanks prevented large ships from drawing close enough to embark troops, and the sight of tens of thousands still standing exposed in lines made the task seem impossible. But at the Mole, where deep water hugged the structure, destroyers, troop ships, and merchant vessels could edge alongside and take men aboard in their thousands. The scene quickly transformed from improvisation into necessity. British sailors rigged ropes, ladders, and makeshift gangways along the wooden planks, guiding columns of soldiers as they shuffled forward in exhausted silence. Each step along the mole was a passage between terror and salvation. Behind them the advancing Germans, overhead the menace of the Luftwaffe, and ahead the faint hope of England's shores. But the mole was no safe haven. Time and again German bombers targeted it, sending geysers of water towering on either side as explosives struck perilously close. Splinters of wood tore free as shockwaves rattled the fragile structure, throwing soldiers off balance, yet still the lines moved. The smell of cordite mixed with sea spray hung in the air as men clutched their rifles and helmets, praying the next dive bomb would not obliterate the pier beneath their feet. And yet, despite the chaos, discipline prevailed. Officers barked orders, naval personnel steadied ropes, and soldiers, though hollow-eyed with fatigue, kept inching forward, driven by the single, unshakable instinct to survive. Night brought no reprieve. Under the dim glow of lanterns, and with the moonlight shimmering on the waves, embarkations continued in near silence, broken only by the grinding of ships' hulls against the mole and the steady tramp of boots. Men carried the wounded in stretchers, struggling not to trip on the narrow planks. Sailors pulled them aboard with outstretched arms, often risking their balance and plunging into the black water below. A single misstep could mean drowning in the oily, debris-strewn harbour. Yet the line pressed on with grim determination. For many, the memory of that endless shuffle onto ships became seared in their minds more vividly than any firefight, a liminal passage between death and deliverance. By the end of the evacuation, it was through the mole that the majority of the British Expeditionary Force escaped. More than 200,000 men would tread its length, boarding destroyers, ferries and trawlers moored side by side. The wooden breakwater, battered and scarred, groaned under the weight of history. It had not been designed for heroism, yet it became a monument of it, a place where ordinary soldiers passed into the arms of sailors and where the survival of an army depended not on grand fortifications or mighty arsenals, but on the endurance of a simple wooden pier. In the story of Dunkirk, the mole stands as one of its most striking symbols, fragile in form, immense in purpose, a bridge between despair and hope. While British soldiers streamed toward the beaches and the mole in their desperate bid for evacuation, another story was unfolding on the burning soil of northern France, a story of courage, sacrifice, and grim resolve. Along the shrinking defensive perimeter encircling Dunkirk, French divisions held their ground with a determination that would astonish even their German adversaries. These men knew, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, that their fate was sealed. For them, there would be no mass evacuation across the Channel, no return to homeland farms and families. Their orders were brutal in simplicity: hold the line, delay the German advance, and buy precious time so that the British Expeditionary Force could escape. Theirs was the role of the doomed guardian, and they shouldered it with unflinching valour. The perimeter stretched across canals, villages, and patches of open countryside. Each bridge, each road junction, each cluster of stone farmhouses became a fortress. The French rearguard, made up of tired regular infantry, hastily reorganised units, and even remnants of armoured formations, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were the last wall between annihilation and salvation. German panzer columns pressed relentlessly, their engines growling as they advanced with mechanized speed. Stukas shrieked overhead, dropping bombs that churned the earth into firestorms. Yet time and again the French defenders held. Machine guns rattled from hidden nests, rifles cracked from shattered windows, and artillery batteries fired until their barrels glowed red. With every volley, with every stand, they clawed back an hour here, half a day there. Small fragments of time that meant everything to the men still waiting on Dunkirk's beaches. The price of this defiance was staggering. Casualties mounted in waves. Villages like Bergs, Bray Dunes, and Gravelines were reduced to smouldering ruins as French soldiers fought street by street, house by house, unwilling to yield. At times, entire companies were wiped out in desperate last stands. Yet, even as positions crumbled, the defenders regrouped, rallying around surviving officers, forming new lines and continuing the fight. Stories abound of small detachments refusing to retreat even when encircled, forcing German units to expend precious time and resources in rooting them out. Each moment of resistance was a thread in the larger fabric of Dunkirk's survival, a tapestry woven from blood and sacrifice. French officers understood the cruel arithmetic of their mission. Every soldier who fell, every gun that fired its last shell, extended the window of evacuation for the British across the water. Without the stubborn defiance of these divisions, the beaches might have been overrun in days rather than held for a week. The world remembers the armada of little ships, the queues of British soldiers boarding destroyers, and the miracle of rescue. But too often forgotten is the shield of flesh and steel that made it possible. For every man who sailed to safety, a French soldier remained behind, firing until his ammunition was gone, then fighting on with bayonets, grenades, or sheer defiance. As the days wore on and the perimeter shrank, the French continued to hold their ground with astonishing bravery. By early June, when the evacuation was drawing to its close, these divisions still manned their posts, even as German pressure became unbearable. In the final hours, they were overwhelmed, not by lack of courage, but by sheer exhaustion and numbers. Many were killed outright. Many more marched into captivity. Yet their valor was undeniable, their sacrifice immeasurable. Dunkirk's survival, and indeed Britain's chance to continue the war, rested squarely on their shoulders. In the story of Dunkirk, the French defenders at the perimeter embody a different kind of heroism, not the heroism of escape, but the heroism of deliberate sacrifice. They fought not for their own survival, but for the survival of others. Without their stand, the evacuation would have collapsed in chaos, and the British Expeditionary Force might have been lost in its entirety. History must remember them not as a footnote, but as central figures in the miracle of Dunkirk, the men who stayed behind so that others might live. Even as the sands of time slipped away at Dunkirk, another drama was unfolding to the south, a tale of selfless defiance that remains one of the most heroic and tragic episodes of the entire campaign. In and around the city of Lille, the French First Army found itself encircled by German forces. Trapped, cut off, and battered from all directions, these men faced an impossible choice: surrender quickly and save themselves, or resist with everything they had. Knowing that their fate was already sealed, they chose the latter. What followed was a stand that would echo in history, a desperate 4-day struggle that bought irreplaceable time for hundreds of thousands of men to escape through Dunkirk. The French First Army, commanded by General Jean-Baptiste Molinier, had already been hammered by weeks of continuous fighting. Exhaustion weighed on every man, supplies of food and ammunition were dwindling, and morale, though strained, was stiffened by the knowledge of what was at stake. Facing them were elements of Germany's most formidable formations, including divisions under the command of generals like Heinz Guderian, whose armoured spearheads had been slicing through France with unstoppable speed. Lille itself, an industrial city with factories, warehouses and dense neighbourhoods, was about to become a fortress. Every street, every alley, every brick wall was turned into a battleground. The Germans expected the French to collapse quickly under the pressure of their encirclement. Instead, they encountered a resistance so fierce that even hardened panzer crews were astonished. French artillery batteries roared from concealed positions, their shells exploding among German columns as they attempted to tighten the noose. Infantry units dug in among the rubble of ruined buildings, sniping from windows, hurling grenades from behind barricades, and fighting with the grim determination of men with nothing left to lose. French tanks, though few and battered, rumbled through narrow streets, ambushing German vehicles at close quarters, firing until they themselves were destroyed. Every skirmish, every stand was a cry of defiance. For 4 days, from May 28th to May 31st, 1940, the battle raged. German forces poured shells into the city block by block, flattening entire districts in their effort to break the defenders. The skies overhead thundered with Luftwaffe raids, raining bombs on soldiers and civilians alike. Yet, even as the city burned, the French refused to yield. In one district after another, German troops would advance, only to be met with stubborn counterattacks that clawed back lost ground, or with barricades manned by men who fought until the last bullet. Civilians too played their part, carrying water, guiding soldiers through the labyrinth of alleys, and sheltering the wounded amid the chaos. Lille became not merely a battlefield, but a symbol of French endurance. The cost was catastrophic. Casualties mounted by the hour, with thousands killed or wounded. Ammunition stocks dwindled until defenders were reduced to rationing their last shells, firing only at the closest targets and then relying on bayonets or hand-to-hand combat. Units that once numbered in the hundreds dwindled to handfuls of exhausted, bloodied men. And still, they held on. General Molinier himself refused to abandon his troops, moving from sector to sector, encouraging men, organizing last-ditch defenses, and embodying the spirit of resistance. The soldiers knew the truth. There would be no rescue for them, no evacuation across the Channel. Their struggle was not for their own survival, but for the survival of others, chiefly the British and French troops still crowding the beaches of Dunkirk, waiting for the Armada to carry them away. By tying down 7 full German divisions, including 4 panzer divisions, the defenders of Lille performed an extraordinary service. For every day they fought, for every German tank they delayed, thousands more men escaped from Dunkirk. Their sacrifice directly translated into lives saved and into Britain's ability to continue the war. Without Lille's stand, the encirclement around Dunkirk might have closed far more swiftly, sealing off the beaches and trapping the BF in its entirety. Instead, the French First Army's doomed defiance granted the evacuation precious breathing space. On May 31st, after 4 days of brutal combat, General Molinier and his exhausted survivors finally laid down their arms. Roughly 40,000 French soldiers marched into captivity, many with bandaged wounds, most hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, hunger, and ceaseless battle. They were beaten but unbowed. Their captors, German officers hardened by victories across Europe, offered uncharacteristic respect, saluting their courage and acknowledging that Lille's resistance had been fought with extraordinary honor. For the French, this was no consolation. They had lost everything: men, weapons, freedom. Yet in their sacrifice lay the salvation of hundreds of thousands of others. The stand at Lille is one of those moments in history where the true cost of survival is revealed. The world remembers Dunkirk as a miracle, a deliverance against all odds. But miracles are never free. They are paid for, often in blood, by those who give their all so that others may live. The French First Army at Lille paid that price in full. Their sacrifice is carved into the legacy of Dunkirk, not on the beaches but in the ruined streets of a burning city, where men fought to the very end, knowing they fought not for themselves but for the future. Dunkirk, already battered by weeks of war, was about to endure one of its most terrifying nights. On the outskirts of the port, immense oil storage tanks, repositories of precious fuel meant for ships and industry, stood as ominous targets for the Luftwaffe. The Germans, determined to cripple any hope of Allied escape, launched wave after wave of bombers with a single deadly purpose: to ignite these reservoirs and turn the harbour into an inferno. As dusk settled over the city, the droning hum of approaching Heinkel and Dornier bombers filled the air, their silhouettes etched black against the fading light. Then came the whistle of falling bombs, followed by colossal explosions that shook the ground like earthquakes. One by one, the oil tanks ruptured, their contents bursting into towering pillars of flame. In seconds, the night sky above Dunkirk was no longer dark. It glowed like a furnace. The inferno spread with terrifying speed. Thick, choking smoke rolled across the waterfront, blanketing the city and beaches in a suffocating fog that turned day to night. The flames climbed hundreds of feet into the air, casting a ghastly orange glow visible for miles across the Channel. British and French soldiers waiting on the sands watched in silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering firestorm. Some believed they were witnessing the death of Dunkirk, that no evacuation could survive in such conditions. The heat was so intense that it blistered paint from buildings and warped steel. Glass windows shattered in distant houses, while the acrid stench of burning fuel coated the tongue and lungs of anyone who breathed it. The crackle of fire mingled with the crash of collapsing tanks, creating a symphony of destruction that seemed almost inhuman in scale. Yet amidst the chaos, the flames became both curse and paradoxical ally. The blinding light from the inferno made it impossible for German bombers to conceal their approach. Silhouetted against the firelit sky, they became easier prey for British fighters patrolling above. At sea, the burning skyline acted as a grim beacon. For the Royal Navy and the little ships navigating the treacherous waters of the Channel, Dunkirk's flaming harbour was unmistakable, guiding them toward the shore even in the dead of night. Captains described steering their vessels by the glow alone, as if a torch had been raised in the heavens to mark the place of salvation. For the men trapped on the beaches, however, the inferno was a constant reminder of peril. They huddled in the sand as fragments of burning oil rained down, sparks drifting on the wind like malevolent fireflies. The roar of the flames was unceasing, a background chorus to the already relentless artillery and aerial bombardment. Many soldiers would later recall that Dunkirk smelled of smoke, oil, and fear, a mixture never forgotten for the rest of their lives. Refugees who had not yet fled the city stumbled through the firelit streets, clutching belongings and children, their faces masks of despair as buildings collapsed around them. Dunkirk was no longer just a port under siege, it had become a sea of flames, a vision from hell itself. Still, within that blazing destruction, the evacuation pressed on. Naval officers barked orders, small craft pressed forward, and troops kept moving toward the mole and the waiting ships. The Germans had hoped that the inferno would break Allied morale, but instead it steeled the resolve of those fighting to escape. Dunkirk burned, but Dunkirk endured, and from that inferno rose not only columns of black smoke, but also the unyielding determination of a trapped army refusing to surrender. By the third day of the evacuation, Dunkirk had become a paradox of war, chaos and order existing side by side in an uneasy harmony. The beaches were crowded with tens of thousands of men, exhausted and hungry, some nursing wounds, all waiting desperately for rescue. They stood in lines that stretched for hundreds of yards, rifles slung over their shoulders, helmets tilted back against the sun, their faces smeared with grime and weariness. From a distance, it appeared as if the entire army had dissolved into a mass of disorder, but up close the scene revealed something extraordinary. An iron thread of discipline running through the chaos. Officers shouted orders above the roar of artillery, rallying men into columns, assigning units to embarkation points, and ensuring that even in their most desperate hour, the British Expeditionary Force would not disintegrate into panic. Along the water's edge, soldiers waded waist-deep into the channel, clinging to ropes strung out to guide them toward waiting boats. The larger ships, unable to beach themselves in shallow water, lay anchored offshore, so the smaller craft, the lifeboats, fishing vessels, and hastily requisitioned pleasure yachts, ferried men back and forth in endless shuttle runs. Each boat was loaded with precision. Troops climbed aboard in silence, their heavy boots thudding on wooden planks, as sailors counted heads, balanced the weight, and pushed off quickly before the next shell or bomb struck. The efficiency was astonishing given the circumstances. Men who had spent days under relentless fire still found the strength to obey orders with calm determination, moving in steady lines even as explosions geysered water around them. On the east mole, the long, narrow stone pier jutting into the sea, an extraordinary feat of organization unfolded. Naval officers transformed this fragile structure, never designed for mass embarkation, into the beating heart of the evacuation. Hour after hour, destroyers and troopships edged up alongside the mole, their decks lined with sailors throwing down gangways and hauling men aboard. Soldiers marched in single file, heads bowed against the spray, the pier trembling beneath their boots as German bombs fell closer and closer. The mole became a conveyor belt of survival. It was said that as many as 200 men could board a ship every 5 minutes, an astonishing rate given the pressure. Each embarkation was a gamble, the line of soldiers exposed and vulnerable, yet they pressed forward with remarkable steadiness, their discipline holding firm against the chaos erupting around them. Overhead, the Luftwaffe struck relentlessly. Dive bombers screamed down in their terrifying Stuka attacks, their sirens wailing like mechanical banshees, releasing payloads that tore craters into the beaches and blasted men from their feet. Yet even in the aftermath of a bombing run, the lines reformed, medics darted forward to tend the wounded, stretcher-bearers carried men away, and the living resumed their march toward the water. Discipline became their shield against despair. Soldiers later recalled how, instead of succumbing to panic, men simply shuffled forward, heads low, determined to reach the safety of the ships. At sea, the orderliness of embarkation was mirrored by the daring seamanship of the rescuers. Skippers of the little ships maneuvered with calm skill among the wreckage, guiding their vessels between smoking hulks and debris-choked waters. Some captains, veterans of quiet peacetime fishing or leisure sailing, found themselves directing evacuations under fire with a coolness that astonished even naval officers. Each craft had its rhythm: load as many men as possible, cast off, deliver them to a destroyer or transport, then return for more. The work was relentless, the danger constant, but the organization rarely faltered. The soldiers waiting on the sand were not blind to the risks. They watched ships torn apart by bombs or torpedoes, men leaping into the oily water as flames consumed their decks. They saw comrades cut down in the shallows, their bodies carried away by the tide. Yet still the lines held, still the men obeyed the shouted orders, still the machine of evacuation turned. It was this balance of chaos and discipline, raw desperation tempered by order, that allowed an impossible feat to continue. Against all odds, the evacuation was not collapsing into panic, but transforming into one of the most organized withdrawals in military history. By nightfall, the rhythm of embarkation became almost mechanical. Columns of men moved silently under the pale glow of flares and searchlights, their shadows long and wavering across the sand. The crash of bombs, the flash of tracer fire, the wail of sirens, all of it became background noise to the singular, unbreakable purpose: get aboard, get home, and fight another day. Dunkirk may have been on fire, and death may have stalked the shoreline, but discipline held the line. And because of that discipline, the miracle was still alive. The miracle of Dunkirk was not only forged on the beaches and in the waters of the Channel, it was also cemented in the hearts of the British people by the voice of one man. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, newly at the helm of a government forged in crisis, understood better than anyone that the evacuation was both salvation and danger. Yes, the British Expeditionary Force had been plucked from the jaws of annihilation, but it had left behind its guns, its tanks, its vehicles, an entire arsenal that had taken years to assemble. Britain stood virtually naked of heavy weapons, its army safe but stripped bare. To admit this to the public would risk despair. To paint it as triumph would court complacency. And so Churchill chose his words with surgical precision, crafting a message that could both steel the nation for hardship and ignite in them the fire of defiance. On June the 4th, 1940, the House of Commons was hushed as Churchill rose to deliver what would become one of the most immortal speeches in history. He began not with grand declarations, but with sober honesty. He detailed the scale of the rescue. Over 338,000 men saved from death or captivity, plucked from the sands of Dunkirk in the face of overwhelming firepower. He called it what it was: a miracle of deliverance, an extraordinary achievement that had confounded the enemy's expectations. But then, with a voice weighted by both pride and warning, Churchill reminded the chamber, and through it the nation, that wars are not won by retreats. Dunkirk was not victory, it was survival. His words painted images as vivid as any battle scene. He spoke of the armada of little ships, of the courage of the Royal Navy, of the steadfast French who had shielded the evacuation with their lives. Yet beneath the rhythm of his sentences lay a note of iron. Britain must not rest, must not congratulate itself too long, must not imagine the struggle was over. Hitler's armies stood only across the Channel. France was collapsing. Invasion was a very real possibility. And so Churchill shifted his tone from reporting to rallying, building cadence upon cadence until his words became thunder. "We shall not flag or fail," he proclaimed. "We shall go on to the end." His voice grew heavier with defiance as he painted the map of Britain in words. "We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air." He promised resistance everywhere, on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, in the streets, in the hills. And then the line that seared itself into the soul of a nation: "We shall never surrender." These words were not merely rhetoric, they were a shield against despair, a vow that Britain would fight even if cornered, even if alone, even if the empire itself was dragged into the abyss. For the men who had stumbled back from Dunkirk, dirty, hungry, shaken, many convinced they had been defeated, Churchill's words transformed their ordeal. They were no longer men who had fled. They were survivors of a deliverance ordained by courage and destiny. The miracle had not been theirs alone. It belonged to every fisherman who sailed, every RAF pilot who fought unseen in the skies, every French soldier who died holding the perimeter. And now it belonged to the nation, a rallying cry that turned despair into steel. The speech echoed far beyond the chamber walls. Across Britain, in pubs and factories, in schools and homes, the words carried on radio waves, stiffening spines, drawing tears, igniting a spirit that refused to bow. Across the Atlantic in the United States, Churchill's defiance stirred admiration and sympathy, sowing seeds of support that would later bloom into alliance. Even in occupied Europe, where radios were hidden under floorboards and listened to in whispers, the sound of Britain's resolve was a beacon that pierced the darkness. Thus Churchill framed Dunkirk not as the end, but as the beginning of a greater struggle. The miracle of deliverance was not the closing of a chapter, but the turning of a page into one of the most perilous yet resolute eras in British history. The evacuation had saved an army. Churchill's words saved a nation's will to fight. And in that combination, steel plucked from fire and fire forged into words, lay the true miracle of Dunkirk. As the beaches of Dunkirk emptied and the endless columns of weary soldiers were ferried across the channel, the miracle of evacuation was not sustained by chance alone. Behind the great exodus stood men who knew they would not be going home. Men who bore the unbearable burden of staying behind so that others could escape. These were the rearguards, British and French alike, who held their positions under a sky thick with smoke and shrapnel, who fought not for victory, but for time. Every hour they clung to the ruins of farmhouses, ditches, and shattered villages, bought life for thousands waiting on the sands. Their struggle was less visible than the crowded beaches, less celebrated than the flotilla of little ships, but without them, there would have been no deliverance. The British rearguard was formed largely from elements of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, the 1st Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and other scattered companies who were ordered to delay the German advance at all costs. They were not simply fighting soldiers, they were, in essence, condemned men given one final duty. They dug into the hedgerows of Flanders, turning barns into fortresses and crossroads into killing grounds. With rifles that overheated, Bren guns that jammed from overuse, and ammunition running dangerously low, they faced the steel tide of panzers and mechanized infantry pressing relentlessly toward Dunkirk. Yet they held, hour after punishing hour. Many fought to the very last bullet, some fixing bayonets when ammunition was gone, their defiance echoing in the fields long after their guns fell silent. Parallel to their stand, the French army's sacrifice was monumental. General Molinier and his men of the French First Army were tasked with the impossible, to defend the perimeter until the very end, knowing that escape would be denied them. Their regiments entrenched themselves along canals and ruined streets, fighting with a ferocity born of both duty and despair. In Lille, encircled and cut off, nearly 40,000 French soldiers fought for 4 days against 7 German divisions, including panzer units. Their resistance delayed the enemy so effectively that tens of thousands more Allied troops reached the beaches unmolested. The Germans themselves, astonished by the ferocity of the defence, granted the French survivors the rare honour of a military salute when at last they surrendered. On the final nights of evacuation, the beaches grew eerily quiet. The long lines of troops had dwindled, the little ships had turned for home, and only small clusters of exhausted soldiers remained. Covering them were the last detachments of British troops, artillery crews firing their last shells, engineers blowing bridges behind them, and riflemen crouched in the shadows waiting for the next German probe. Among them was the 1st Battalion, Cheshire Regiment, whose machine gunners held canal crossings until their barrels glowed red. Others, such as the men of the 2nd Royal Norfolk, made their fateful stand at Le Paradis, where after hours of desperate resistance they were finally overrun. Their surrender ended not in safety but in massacre, when over 90 captured men were executed by SS troops, an atrocity that underscored the cost of the rearguard's defiance. Meanwhile, at Dunkirk itself, the final embarkations took place under constant threat. Rearguard soldiers clung to their positions along the defensive perimeter until the very last launches departed. The order of withdrawal was brutal in its clarity. The Royal Navy would leave on the night of June the 3rd, with only a handful of small craft remaining to retrieve the rearguards. Those who could not be taken off were to destroy their weapons and prepare for capture. Some units fought until dawn on June the 4th, buying precious minutes even as the evacuation officially ended. By that morning, only silence remained on the beaches. The last British detachments had slipped into captivity, and the last French defenders continued firing until they too were overwhelmed. For the men who stayed behind, there was no glory, no miracle of return, no cheering crowds awaiting them at Dover. Many perished where they stood. Others marched into years of captivity behind barbed wire. Yet their courage was no less vital than that of the soldiers saved. They were the unseen backbone of Operation Dynamo, the living wall that stood between annihilation and survival. Without their sacrifice, the evacuation would have collapsed in chaos, with German forces storming the beaches before the ships had finished their rescue. History often remembers Dunkirk as an escape, a deliverance against impossible odds. But in truth, it was also a graveyard of silent heroism, where the rearguards wrote their chapter in blood and defiance. They were the last to leave, or more accurately, the ones who never left at all. Their final stand ensured that Britain would live to fight another day, and though their names are less spoken, the echo of their valour lingers in every retelling of the Dunkirk miracle. As the final ships pulled away from Dunkirk's battered shores in the early hours of June 4, 1940, the desperate clamour of evacuation gave way to a deafening silence. The thunder of engines and the rush of boots on the wooden planks of the mole faded, replaced by the lonely cries of gulls and the whisper of the tide. For those who remained, the French soldiers who had stood so valiantly on the perimeter, there was no deliverance, only the bitter taste of abandonment. Tens of thousands of men, exhausted, hungry, and covered in the grime of endless combat, now faced the certainty of capture. These were not the forgotten or the unwanted, they were the shield that had allowed the miracle at Dunkirk to happen. Yet fate had decreed that while hundreds of thousands would return across the Channel, these men would stay behind in the tightening grip of the enemy. Across the beaches, shattered rifles and discarded helmets lay strewn in the sand, silent testimony to a fight that had lasted to the very end. Groups of French soldiers gathered in uneasy clusters, their faces lit by the first pale glow of dawn. Some stood defiantly, weapons still slung across their shoulders, unwilling to let go of the discipline that had carried them through. Others slumped against the dunes, their eyes glazed with exhaustion and disbelief. They had held the line with courage that defied calculation, standing in the path of German tanks and artillery, often with little more than rifles and dwindling ammunition. They had obeyed orders that meant certain death or imprisonment, not for glory, but so that the soldiers of Britain and their own comrades might escape. Now, in the stillness of Dunkirk's aftermath, they awaited their captors, knowing the price had been paid, but unsure if anyone would remember who had borne it. When the Germans arrived, it was not in the frenzy of battle, but with the grim efficiency of victors. Columns of Wehrmacht troops marched into Dunkirk, their boots crunching on the sand, rifles glinting in the morning light. They found no enemy charging to meet them, no machine gun nests firing in desperation, only weary figures who had fought until the very last and could fight no more. French officers stood tall, presenting their swords, while enlisted men raised their hands in silence. In one of history's cruelest contrasts, just across the Channel, the news of evacuation was being celebrated, while here, only a few dozen miles away, these men were swallowed into captivity. For many, it was the beginning of years of hardship behind barbed wire. Far from home, their sacrifice obscured by the jubilation of survival elsewhere. Yet their story was not one of defeat alone. The French who stayed behind embodied a valour that deserves to stand alongside the courage of those who escaped. By holding the perimeter until the very end, they bought time, measured not in hours, but in lives, tens of thousands of them. They were the wall that prevented the Germans from crashing into the beaches at the height of evacuation, the shield that allowed ships, boats and barges to keep moving across the Channel unmolested. Without their endurance, the miracle of Dunkirk might have collapsed into a massacre. Their captivity was not in vain, it was the cost of deliverance. For Britain, the chapter of Dunkirk was remembered as a narrow escape, a defiance against annihilation. But for France, it was a tragedy steeped in bitterness. The soldiers left behind were not simply prisoners of war. They were the embodiment of a nation fighting to the very last breath, only to see its soil fall under enemy control. As news of their capture spread, families waited anxiously, clinging to scraps of information, letters smuggled from camps, or rumors passed from one survivor to another. Many would endure the war behind barbed wire, their names forgotten in official speeches, their sacrifice overshadowed by the rhetoric of survival. And yet history cannot erase what happened here. The French soldiers who remained at Dunkirk stand as silent sentinels in the memory of the evacuation. Their courage under impossible circumstances reminds us that miracles are never free. The escape across the Channel was purchased in blood and captivity, and while Churchill's words would ignite the spirit of resistance in Britain, the men left behind on the beaches carried the quieter, heavier burden of sacrifice. Dunkirk was not only the story of deliverance, it was also the story of those who did not come home. For the German High Command, the fall of Dunkirk seemed at first glance like a triumph beyond measure. The beaches that only days earlier had swarmed with enemy troops were now under the black, red and white banners of the Reich. Columns of exhausted French prisoners shuffled through the streets, while wrecked British trucks, tanks and artillery pieces littered the roads and fields. The Luftwaffe swooped overhead in proud formation, their pilots boasting of relentless bombardments that had turned the Channel coast into a graveyard of machinery. German propaganda wasted no time in trumpeting the victory. Across occupied Europe and in the heart of Berlin, loudspeakers blared triumphant news bulletins. The British Expeditionary Force had been swept from the continent, their equipment abandoned, their spirit shattered. Posters, radio broadcasts and newsreels painted Dunkirk as proof of Hitler's unstoppable war machine, a demonstration of German arms at their zenith. And yet, beneath this veneer of triumph, cracks began to show. The reality was far more complex than the speeches and headlines suggested. For while the Germans had indeed forced the Allies from the continent and captured vast amounts of materiel, they had not destroyed the British Army itself. In fact, the very core of the British Expeditionary Force, the trained professional soldiers who formed the backbone of Britain's fighting capability, had escaped across the Channel. Close to 34,000 Allied troops had been evacuated, far more than German planners had ever thought possible. The Wehrmacht had expected the beaches to become a killing ground, yet instead they had become a gateway to survival. For all the smashed lorries and charred tanks, the heart of Britain's military manpower had slipped through their grasp. German soldiers on the ground were themselves astonished at what had happened. Many walked the abandoned beaches in disbelief, finding endless piles of weapons, ammunition and supplies, but relatively few dead. They had captured equipment enough to arm dozens of divisions, yet the enemy himself had disappeared into the fog and smoke of the Channel. For some, this was a source of pride, proof that Germany had forced Britain into retreat. But for others, particularly the sharp-eyed officers of the Wehrmacht, it was a bitter realization. Victory had come, yes, but not the decisive annihilation that could have ended the war with Britain before it had truly begun. In Berlin, the mood was a strange mixture of celebration and frustration. Joseph Goebbels, master of propaganda, seized the opportunity to craft a narrative of total dominance. In films and newspapers, Dunkirk was portrayed as the catastrophic collapse of Britain's military prestige. The world was told that England had fled in disgrace, abandoning its allies, leaving France to be crushed alone. Hitler himself, standing before his generals, hailed the operation as proof of German invincibility. Yet behind the carefully composed photographs and staged parades, unease gnawed at the truth. Hitler knew, as did many in his command, that the British army still existed, and it was back across the Channel, regrouping, rearming, and preparing for the next stage of war. The Luftwaffe too faced uncomfortable questions. Hermann Goering, who had promised Hitler that his air force would finish the job at Dunkirk, boasted loudly of success, claiming that British losses had been devastating. But the numbers told a different story. Though hundreds of ships had been sunk or damaged, the vast majority of evacuation vessels had slipped through. The Royal Navy had endured a bruising ordeal, yet it had not been broken. The RAF, far from being destroyed, had fought above the beaches with determination, gaining vital experience that would soon be tested in the skies over Britain itself. Goering's failure to crush the evacuation would quietly erode his credibility in the eyes of fellow commanders, even as his propaganda machine claimed a great victory. Most of all, Dunkirk left Hitler himself with a nagging sense of unfinished business. His armies had conquered in a matter of weeks what Germany had failed to achieve in 4 years during the First World War. France lay vulnerable, Belgium and the Netherlands had fallen, and the Allies had been driven to the sea. Yet the one blow that could have broken Britain, the annihilation of its expeditionary force, had slipped through his fingers. In later years, historians would debate endlessly the causes of this failure. The infamous halt order that paused German armour at a critical moment, the overconfidence of commanders who believed the British were already doomed, or Hitler's own hopes of leaving the door open to a negotiated peace with Britain. Whatever the reason, the fact remained that Dunkirk was both a triumph and a lost opportunity. In the villages and towns of Germany, the public celebrated the supposed victory, unaware of its hollow centre. School children marched in parades, newspapers trumpeted Britain's humiliation, and Hitler's image was raised higher than ever. But in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill spoke words that cut through the illusion. In his speech to the House of Commons on June the 4th, he warned the world that wars are not won by evacuations. He acknowledged the miracle of deliverance, but reminded his people that the struggle was far from over. This was the critical truth that German propaganda tried to obscure. Dunkirk had not ended the war, it had merely transformed it. Thus, the German triumph at Dunkirk was real, but incomplete. A victory of territory, of captured guns and abandoned vehicles, but not of decisive destruction. Britain's soldiers had escaped, and with them the will to fight on. What Hitler had achieved was dazzling, but what he had failed to achieve would prove even more significant. For the war was not over, it was only entering its darkest and most fateful chapter. The last ships had left Dunkirk, their decks crowded with weary soldiers who had narrowly escaped annihilation. Across the Channel, Britain breathed a collective sigh of relief. What had seemed like certain disaster only days before, the encirclement of the British Expeditionary Force, had been transformed into what Prime Minister Winston Churchill would call a miracle of deliverance. Nearly 34,000 men had been brought back to English shores. Yet though they were saved, Britain now stood in a position both desperate and defiant. For with the fall of France imminent, the island nation knew it would soon stand entirely alone against the colossal military machine of Nazi Germany. The arrival of the soldiers on British soil was greeted with immense relief. Across the ports of Dover, Ramsgate, Margate, and countless smaller harbours, crowds gathered to cheer the returning men. Women handed out hot tea, sandwiches and cigarettes to troops who staggered down gangways, still in their mud-caked uniforms, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. The atmosphere was one of profound gratitude, an acknowledgement that these soldiers had been snatched from the jaws of death. Yet alongside the joy was an undercurrent of sobering reality. The army had left behind almost all of its heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery and trucks lay abandoned in France. What returned was not a fully equipped fighting force, but rather, as Churchill admitted, the whole root and core of the British army. This reality could not be ignored. Britain's very survival was now at stake. With France collapsing under the relentless German advance, the English Channel was all that separated Britain from invasion. The Wehrmacht, victorious on the continent, now turned its gaze toward the island. The Luftwaffe prepared for the skies above southern England, while German naval planners began to contemplate Operation Sea Lion, the audacious plan to invade Britain itself. For the first time in centuries, Britain faced the genuine prospect of conquest on its own soil. Yet if Britain was vulnerable, it was also resolute. The miracle of Dunkirk had stirred the nation's spirit. Newspapers captured the mood, portraying the evacuation not as a defeat, but as an extraordinary deliverance. Posters and radio broadcasts urged citizens to prepare for invasion, digging trenches, building barricades, and fashioning makeshift defences. The Home Guard, nicknamed Dad's Army, was formed from volunteers too old or too young for regular service, armed at first with little more than hunting rifles, farm tools, and determination. Civil defence drills became part of daily life, and air raid sirens became the soundtrack of Britain's nights. Churchill, aware of the precarious situation, rose to the occasion with words that would echo through history. On June 4, 1940, he stood before the House of Commons and delivered one of his most stirring speeches. He acknowledged the reality: wars are not won by evacuations, but he infused the nation with steel, declaring in defiant tones, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall never surrender." These words, broadcast across the nation and reprinted in every newspaper, reassured the British people that though they stood alone, they would not bend. And so Britain, isolated but unbroken, prepared for what lay ahead. Families sent their children to the countryside to protect them from the looming air raids. Civilians blacked out their windows to conceal their homes from enemy bombers. Fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force readied themselves for the battle that was sure to come. The struggle for control of the skies over Britain. The spirit of Dunkirk, that combination of endurance, sacrifice and unity, became a rallying cry for the nation. Though the road ahead would be long and perilous, Britain had been granted a reprieve. The soldiers brought back from Dunkirk would form the backbone of its future defence. The island had not fallen. Against staggering odds, the heart of the British Army had been saved. And with that salvation, the chance remained. Fragile, tenuous, but real, for Britain to resist, to endure, and ultimately to fight back. At that moment in the summer of 1940, Britain truly stood alone, but it stood unyielding, its resolve hardened by survival, and its destiny tied to the battles yet to come. Dunkirk had been a miracle of deliverance. Now the nation braced itself for its greatest test, the coming storm in the skies, the Battle of Britain. By mid-June 1940, the fate of France had been sealed. The German Blitzkrieg, unleashed in May, had torn through the Ardennes, smashed through Sedan and driven like a spear to the English Channel, splitting Allied armies apart. Paris, the beating heart of France, its capital, its soul, was now threatened with encirclement. Refugees clogged the roads, millions of civilians pushing carts, bicycles and horse-drawn wagons laden with their lives, fleeing southward in a tide of despair. Families abandoned homes, businesses, and generations of roots, carrying only what they could in their arms. Alongside them, retreating soldiers, hungry, exhausted, disorganized, struggled to form coherent lines. France, which had stood as one of Europe's great military powers, seemed to unravel before the eyes of its people. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The city had been declared an open city to spare it destruction. There were no barricades, no defenders at its gates, only silence and the hollow sound of boots striking cobblestones. The swastika was hoisted above the Eiffel Tower. The Champs-Élysées, once a boulevard of triumphs and celebrations, now echoed with the columns of the Wehrmacht. For Parisians who remained, the sight was surreal and unbearable. The City of Lights had dimmed into occupation, its monuments now backdrops for the conqueror's propaganda. In Bordeaux, the French government struggled to maintain composure. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, weary and defeated, resigned. His place was taken by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the World War I hero of Verdun. At 84 years old, revered by many as a fatherly figure, Pétain believed that further resistance was futile. In his gravelly voice, broadcast over the radio, he told the French people, "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you we must cease fighting." For millions of French citizens who had clung to hope, these words fell like a hammer, confirmation that their nation was broken, their leaders resigned to submission. But Adolf Hitler sought more than surrender. He sought spectacle. He demanded that the French delegation meet him not in Berlin, not in some neutral hall, but in the forest of Compiègne, north of Paris, the very site where Germany had signed the humiliating armistice that ended World War I in 1918. There, in a secluded clearing, rested a modest railway carriage. 22 years earlier, in that very coach, German generals had accepted France's victory terms, forced to bow before Marshal Foch and the Allies. Now, Hitler returned to the same place, the same carriage, to reverse history. On June the 21st, 1940, the French delegation, led by General Charles Hunziker, arrived in the clearing at Compiègne. It was a scene heavy with symbolism, designed entirely to satisfy Hitler's thirst for vengeance. The German Führer stood silently as the French entered. He said little, offered no handshakes, and listened impatiently as the terms were read. The conditions were brutal. France would be divided in two. The north and west, including Paris, would be occupied by Germany, while the south would remain under a puppet regime based in Vichy, led by Pétain. The French army would be disbanded, reduced to a token force. Its navy, though not surrendered, was to be neutralized to prevent it from joining the Allies. France, proud and independent for centuries, was reduced to a nation shackled. When the signing was complete, Hitler stood, gave a curt salute, and departed abruptly. He did not wait to see the French delegation sign the document. For him, the humiliation had been delivered, the revenge complete. The next day, June 22nd, 1940, the armistice officially came into effect. France, once the bastion of European culture and military might, had collapsed in 6 weeks. The consequences were staggering. An estimated 1.5 million French soldiers marched into captivity, bound for German prison camps where they would languish for years. Civilians now faced the grim reality of occupation, rationing, curfews, censorship, and the constant presence of German soldiers in their streets. For those in the occupied zone, life would be lived under the shadow of the swastika. In the so-called Free Zone, Pétain's government in Vichy promised order and stability, but in reality, it became a regime of collaboration, enforcing German demands and betraying French resistance. Yet amid the ashes of defeat, not all Frenchmen accepted submission. A little-known brigadier general, Charles de Gaulle, had already fled to London. On June 18th, just days before the armistice, he broadcast a message over the BBC, urging his countrymen to continue the fight. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. His words, though scarcely heard at the time, would later become the rallying cry of Free France, planting the seed of resistance that would grow in secret under occupation. For now, however, France lay broken. The dream of a united Allied defence of Europe had shattered. Britain stood alone, isolated, facing the storm of German power across the Channel. And Hitler, triumphant at last, turned his gaze westward, preparing the next phase of his conquest, the Battle of Britain. The guns fell silent for some, but not with relief. For tens of thousands of French and British soldiers left behind after Dunkirk, the end of fighting did not mean safety, it meant captivity. Along the roads of northern France and Belgium, under the watchful eyes of German guards with bayonets fixed and rifles slung across their shoulders, began the slow, brutal marches of prisoners of war into the heart of the Reich. These were not swift transports or orderly relocations. They were columns of exhausted men, stripped of dignity, trudging mile after mile with blistered feet, hollow stomachs, and despair weighing on their shoulders heavier than their packs ever had. The marches began almost immediately after surrender. German officers, often efficient and methodical, herded masses of prisoners together in makeshift collection points, fields, barns, courtyards, and schoolyards. Then the order came, march, and the long trek east began. Thousands shuffled in line, stretching as far as the eye could see, winding through ruined villages and countryside scarred by artillery craters and smouldering wreckage. Soldiers who had stood firm only days before were now stripped of weapons, helmets, and pride, carrying nothing but fatigue. The relentless June sun beat down on them, baking the dust into their mouths, while the nights brought bitter cold. Food was scarce, sometimes a crust of bread or a ladle of watery soup handed out irregularly, often not at all. Thirst became an enemy more vicious than German fire. Wells along the road were guarded, and streams were fouled. Many prisoners resorted to cupping hands full of muddy ditches or begging civilians who dared to slip them a morsel of food or flask of water despite German warnings against helping captives. Disease spread rapidly in these weakened bodies. Dysentery, heat exhaustion, and untreated wounds turned columns of men into trails of suffering. British accounts recall men collapsing on the roadside, beaten or kicked by guards if they faltered. Some never rose again. French survivors later spoke of the silence that haunted the marches, not of discipline, but of resignation. Conversation died as men retreated inward, conserving strength to take just one more step. Boots split open, leaving feet raw and bloody, wrapped in rags scavenged from abandoned farms. Still, the marches dragged on, some lasting weeks, covering hundreds of miles until the prisoners reached trains or trucks that carried them deeper into captivity. When they finally arrived at railheads, another ordeal awaited. Prisoners were crammed into cattle cars, 40 or 50 men in each, the doors bolted shut, with barely a slit for air. The stench of sweat, urine, and fear filled the darkness. Hours stretched into days as trains rattled eastward toward Germany. Heat suffocated by day, cold seeped in at night, and there was little food or water. For many, the memory of those train rides was worse than the marches, a crushing reminder that freedom had vanished and their fate was no longer their own. In Germany, vast prisoner of war camps, stalags for enlisted men and oflags for officers, were quickly overwhelmed. Barbed wire enclosures sprouted across the Reich, some hastily prepared, others merely fields fenced in to contain the tide of human captives pouring in from the west. Prisoners slept on bare ground, under open sky, or in overcrowded huts with lice-infested straw. Food rations were meagre, often little more than thin soup and black bread. Malnutrition gnawed at their bodies, sapping the strength of men already weakened by battle and marches. For the French, captivity carried a particular bitterness. Many had fought doggedly to the end, defending Lille, Dunkirk, or the Somme, only to spend the rest of the war behind wire. Officers who had led charges and divisions now found themselves powerless in cramped barracks. Some attempted to maintain morale, organising lectures, improvised concerts, or clandestine news networks to keep hope alive. For British troops, the suffering was compounded by uncertainty. They had seen comrades escape across the Channel, but they themselves remained trapped, their war reduced to waiting in captivity while their country continued to fight. Yet even here, in the depths of defeat, resilience flickered. Escape attempts began almost immediately, men tunneling under fences with spoons, disguising themselves in stolen uniforms or hiding in supply wagons. Though few succeeded, the attempts themselves spoke of an unbroken will. Others clung to discipline, keeping ranks clean, maintaining routine, and refusing to surrender their sense of identity as soldiers. In this way, captivity became another battlefield, not of guns and bombs, but of endurance, spirit, and survival. The POW columns and the camps they fed were a grim testament to the cost of Dunkirk's miracle. Britain had been saved, but many of its sons and countless French comrades paid with years of imprisonment. For them, the war was not over. It was a slow struggle measured in hunger, isolation, and the fading hope of liberation. As the fires of Dunkirk smouldered and the last battered soldiers returned to British shores, what might have been remembered as a crushing military defeat instead transformed into something far more powerful. A national myth, a defining spirit, an identity born from survival against impossible odds. Newspapers across Britain splashed triumphant headlines not of conquest, but of endurance. Families who had feared their fathers, brothers, or sons lost to captivity opened their doors to gaunt, mud-streaked men who carried no rifles, no equipment, often not even their boots, but whose very presence symbolized something beyond military strength, an unbroken will. Crowds lined the streets of Dover, Margate, and London, cheering not the glory of victory, but the miracle of deliverance. These men, who only days before had been hunted across the fields of Flanders, became living proof that Britain, though cornered, was not finished. The phrase Dunkirk spirit began to crystallize in the public imagination, capturing the essence of determination, improvisation, and unity in the face of overwhelming adversity. The government, too, seized upon this narrative. Winston Churchill, with his gift for words, carefully reframed the event. He reminded Parliament and the public that wars were not won by retreats, but in the same breath declared that what had happened at Dunkirk was not an ending, but a beginning. He called it deliverance. Deliverance made possible not just by the Royal Navy or the Army, but by the entire nation, from admirals to fishermen, from soldiers to schoolboys, all contributing to the shared survival. Ordinary people, many of whom had volunteered their small boats to cross the Channel, suddenly found themselves celebrated as national heroes. The image of weathered men from coastal towns steering their pleasure craft into hellfire and returning with dozens of weary soldiers became etched into the collective memory. This merging of civilian and military effort gave rise to a powerful sense of unity. Britain as one body, enduring and defiant together. For the soldiers themselves, returning to England was a strange mix of relief and shame. Many felt they had abandoned their French allies, leaving comrades to captivity and death. Others, stripped of their weapons, tormented by memories of comrades lost on the beaches, wondered how the public would greet them. Yet when they stepped off the ships, they found no scorn, no accusation, but waves of gratitude. Women wept and embraced strangers. Children offered them flowers. Volunteers passed out sandwiches and tea to men who hadn't eaten properly in days. The national embrace of these soldiers, seeing them not as failures but as survivors, was critical in forging the psychological resilience Britain would need in the months to come. In their exhaustion, they embodied courage. In their escape, they represented hope. The Dunkirk spirit did not mean denying the reality of danger. Everyone knew the storm was still gathering. Hitler's armies controlled Western Europe. France had collapsed. Britain now stood alone, exposed to the looming threat of invasion. Yet instead of paralyzing fear, there was defiance. The Dunkirk spirit hardened into a cultural steel, a belief that whatever the odds, the British people would stand together, resist, and endure. It became a rallying cry, invoked in speeches, in newspapers, even in everyday conversations, whenever despair threatened to creep in. This spirit was not about victory in battle. It was about survival, about holding fast until fortune could shift. It was resilience in its purest form, transformed into identity. In the decades that followed, the Dunkirk spirit outlived the war itself. It became shorthand for courage in crisis, for unity in hardship, for Britain's refusal to bend when the storm was at its fiercest. In May and June of 1940, on those burning beaches and in those heaving boats, a nation found not only its soldiers, but itself. And though Dunkirk was no triumph of arms, it was a triumph of spirit, one that would carry Britain through the darkest summer in its history and into the skies above, where the next great battle awaited. History books often provide us with the numbers, the hundreds of thousands evacuated, the ships lost, the divisions destroyed. But to truly understand Dunkirk, we must turn to the words of those who lived it. In their diaries, their hurried letters home, and the memories later recounted in trembling voices, we hear not strategy or statistics, but the raw human experience. These fragments of personal testimony strip away the distance of time and put us on the beaches, in the boats, and among the crowds waiting back in England. They reveal the fear and the hunger, the exhaustion and the relief, the despair and the sudden flashes of hope. Each voice is a thread, and together they weave the tapestry of Dunkirk not as an event in history, but as a lived ordeal. From the soldiers came words marked by dust, sand, and terror. One British private scrawled in his notebook as he crouched in the dunes. "We crouch low when the planes dive. The sand sprays like needles in the wind. Some men don't get up again. The sea is full of smoke and fire. All I want is to see England, even if it's only once more." Another, writing by candle stub on the deck of a transport ship, admitted to his family, "I had to throw away my rifle to swim. I feel ashamed, but I can still write to you. So perhaps there is no shame after all." Such words capture the brutal honesty of men stripped to their most human desires. Not victory, not medals, simply the will to survive and the yearning for home. The sailors, too, recorded their impressions, often with a mixture of grim duty and quiet pride. A Royal Navy officer remembered the horror of steering his destroyer close to the beaches. The water was shallow and littered with wreckage. "We took on so many men that the decks groaned under their weight. They sat silent, faces blank, eyes staring out to sea as if afraid the Germans might come chasing after them even across the waves." For the civilian boatmen, many of whom had never imagined being part of a military operation, the memories burned even brighter. One fisherman from Ramsgate later wrote, "I counted 80 men in my little boat before turning back. They looked half dead, some without shoes, some still clutching helmets as if those bits of steel might keep them safe. When we landed, they tried to thank me, but I told them it was England thanking them." Civilians at home preserved a different perspective. The waiting, the uncertainty, the sheer tidal wave of emotion when the first survivors returned. In London, a mother recorded in her diary, "I stood at Victoria Station with a crowd. When the soldiers came in, filthy and hungry, we just cried. I gave one of them the sandwiches meant for my husband. He ate as though he hadn't seen food in days. I told him he was safe now, and he kissed my hand before moving on." In Dover, a young girl remembered watching the boats arrive. "It was like every kind of ship in the world was suddenly here. They kept coming, bringing men who looked like ghosts. Some smiled, but most just stumbled. People were handing them tea, cigarettes, chocolate, anything. I will never forget the smell of smoke on their clothes. Not all memories were triumphant. Some carried the weight of bitterness and loss. French soldiers, many of whom felt abandoned, wrote of betrayal. One noted bitterly in his journal, "We held the line while the British left. They sailed away while we waited for the Germans. I cannot forget their faces as they departed." Even among the British, there were voices of guilt. An officer confessed decades later, "I never forgave myself for leaving my men behind when my ship filled and pulled away. Their eyes followed me as the beach shrank into the distance. I see them still in my dreams." And yet, amid this pain, there was also a powerful sense of shared humanity. A nurse at a makeshift hospital in Kent remembered tending to the evacuees. They came in burned, wounded, shaking with fever. Some cried, some said nothing at all. But when we washed the sand and blood from their faces, I saw only boys who had seen too much. I held their hands and told them they were safe, even though the war was not yet done. These voices, fragmented, fragile, yet searing in their truth, offer us the most intimate window into Dunkirk. They remind us that beyond the grand strategies and historical analyses, it was lived by ordinary people, each carrying their own fear, their own loss, their own hope. Through their words, we walk again along the burning beaches, feel the rocking of the overcrowded boats, taste the bread and tea given in trembling hands. Dunkirk was not only a moment in history, it was a human experience, remembered in ink and in memory, passed down as testimony for generations yet to come. From the moment the last soldier was hauled aboard a rescue craft and the evacuation of Dunkirk was declared complete, the story of Operation Dynamo began its second life, not merely as a military episode, but as a cultural touchstone destined to be retold, reshaped, and reframed in the decades that followed. Wartime Britain, grappling with both the relief of survival and the foreboding knowledge that the true struggle had only just begun, recognized the power of narrative. Churchill's speeches had already set the tone, transforming a narrow escape into a story of national resilience. Now, film, print, and radio would carry that message to every household, embedding Dunkirk deep into the psyche of Britain's people. Propaganda units quickly seized upon the story, portraying battered troops arriving home as not the remnants of a defeated army but as heroes snatched from the jaws of destruction. Newsreels shown in cinemas across Britain presented carefully chosen images, smiling soldiers sipping tea, civilians waving Union Jacks, the silhouettes of small boats rocking in the channel. It was a curated vision, one that deliberately masked the terror, confusion, and abandonment felt by many, yet it served its purpose to bind the nation to a single unifying myth. As time passed and the war moved on to new stages, the aerial battles over Britain, the desert campaigns, the invasions of Italy and Normandy, Dunkirk remained a fixed point of memory, a reminder of how close Britain had come to disaster, and how sheer determination, luck, and collective effort had averted total collapse. In the post-war years, the retelling took on different tones, shifting from urgent propaganda to reflective commemoration. The 1958 film Dunkirk, starring John Mills, was among the first cinematic attempts to recreate the drama for a new generation. It combined gritty realism with the emotional undertones of a nation looking back at its near defeat, balancing the chaos of battle with the stoicism of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The film did not flinch from showing the confusion and cost, yet its overall message aligned with the growing cultural consensus. Dunkirk was not just a retreat, but a testament to endurance. Over the decades, the evacuation became almost mythological, shorthand for Britain's refusal to yield when the odds were overwhelmingly against it. Writers and historians debated the truth behind the legend. Was it really a miracle, or a lucky escape aided by German miscalculations? But in popular culture, the distinction mattered little. School children learned of the little ships. Novels painted stirring portraits of courage on the beaches, and television documentaries brought archival footage back to life, each retelling cementing Dunkirk as part of the national identity. The myth even outgrew its origins, becoming a phrase in itself. The Dunkirk spirit, invoked not just for war, but for moments of national crisis, whether economic hardship, political strife, or natural disaster. In more recent times, filmmakers revisited Dunkirk with modern tools and perspectives, adding new layers to its cultural presence. Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, 2017, stripped away much of the dialogue and instead emphasized the sensory experience, the roar of aircraft engines, the crash of waves, the claustrophobia of sinking ships. It was less a linear narrative than an immersion, placing audiences into the very heart of the event, demanding they feel the fear, the waiting, and the desperate urgency. It reminded the world that beyond speeches and symbols, Dunkirk was, at its core, about individuals, young men on a beach praying for survival while the horizon burned. Through propaganda, commemoration, debate, and artistic reimagining, Dunkirk has transcended history to become a cultural phenomenon, a story retold in every medium, each generation shaping it to its own needs. For wartime Britain, it was proof of resilience. For post-war Britain, a pillar of national pride. For modern audiences, a timeless tale of human endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. In this way, Dunkirk lives on, not only as a battlefield of 1940, but as a permanent landmark in the collective imagination, where history, memory, and myth blur into one. The story of Dunkirk did not end with the last soldier ferried across the channel. In truth, its deepest meaning only emerged in the long shadows cast afterward, when commanders, politicians, and civilians alike began to reckon with what had been revealed in those days of fire, smoke, and waiting tides. The evacuation was not a victory in the traditional sense. It was a retreat, a withdrawal under pressure, the salvage of men rather than the securing of territory. Yet in its paradoxical nature lay its enduring legacy. Dunkirk became not only a military case study, but also a meditation on survival, leadership, and the limits of human endurance in the face of collapse. It showed how quickly the line between annihilation and perseverance can blur, and how the choices of individuals and the spirit of collectives can redefine disaster into something almost transcendent. One of the clearest lessons was about the nature of war itself. Dunkirk stripped bare the romantic illusions that often accompany martial narratives. Here was no neat set-piece battle with clear lines and ordered movements. Instead, chaos reigned. Hundreds of thousands of men, cut off and exposed, huddled on open sands beneath skies that roared with hostile aircraft. Ships queued helplessly at shallow waters, while columns of smoke from burning oil tanks stained the horizon. The evacuation revealed war as both technological and primal, modern in its machinery, yet ancient in its desperation. It demonstrated that in war, survival often hinges not on grand strategies alone, but on adaptability, improvisation, and the endurance of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary moments. Leadership, too, was tested and redefined at Dunkirk. High command faced brutal realities. The British Expeditionary Force had been outmaneuvered, the French lines collapsing, the Belgian front crumbling. Conventional wisdom might have dictated surrender or annihilation in place. Instead, leadership pivoted towards preservation. Churchill himself, though initially sceptical, sanctioned Operation Dynamo, a decision that preserved Britain's army, and with it, the nation's ability to fight on. On the beaches, junior officers and NCOs displayed a different kind of leadership, maintaining order among frightened men, organizing queues for embarkation, rationing supplies, and suppressing panic. Their task was not to win ground, but to buy time, to shepherd their men towards the chance of survival. Dunkirk thus stands as a case study in flexible leadership. The wisdom to know when to stand, when to retreat, and when the greatest act of courage is to preserve life for battles yet to come. For the soldiers themselves, Dunkirk was an ordeal that revealed the raw edge of human endurance. Days of exposure to hunger, thirst, and exhaustion tested their limits more than enemy fire alone. Men marched to the beaches only to wait for hours or days under strafing runs, their nerves frayed by the constant shriek of Stuka sirens. Many entered the water fully clothed, swimming desperately towards distant ships, clinging to rafts, debris, or one another. Some were pulled under, some drifted back to shore, but many persevered with a will to survive that defied the logic of despair. Their endurance was not only physical but psychological, the strength to endure uncertainty, to trust that rescue would come even as ships burned and comrades fell beside them. Dunkirk revealed in stark clarity that human resilience is as much about spirit as it is about strength. Beyond individuals, Dunkirk illuminated the power of collective effort. The little ships remain perhaps the most symbolic lesson, a fleet of fishing boats, yachts, lifeboats and pleasure craft manned by civilians who braved mines, bombs and rough seas to rescue stranded soldiers. Militarily, their contribution was more symbolic than numerical. The majority of men were evacuated by naval destroyers and ferries, but the cultural and psychological impact was immense. It demonstrated that survival in war is not the work of armies alone, but of entire societies, where civilians can become actors in history rather than mere spectators. The lesson here was profound. When survival is at stake, the boundaries between soldier and civilian, between frontline and home front, blur into one shared struggle. The legacy of Dunkirk also reshaped Britain's outlook on the war. It underscored both vulnerability and resilience. The British public realised how narrowly their army had escaped destruction, how fragile their security truly was. At the same time, the survival of the BEF preserved the possibility of eventual victory. Had those men been lost, Britain's military might have been crippled beyond recovery. Thus, Dunkirk offered a sobering paradox. The very event that revealed Britain's weakness also became the foundation for its endurance. Churchill himself captured this duality, acknowledging the catastrophe avoided while warning that wars are not won by evacuations. His words were both a sobering reminder and a call to arms. Survival was only the beginning, not the end. In the decades since, military strategists have studied Dunkirk for lessons in evacuation logistics, improvisation under pressure, and the interplay between chance and decision. But its larger legacy has always been moral and human, rather than purely tactical. Dunkirk continues to remind us that wars are not always decided by bold offensives or decisive victories. Sometimes, survival itself is the victory, the act of enduring, of refusing annihilation, of preserving the will to continue fighting. It is a legacy written not in triumph, but in endurance, not in conquest, but in the refusal to be destroyed. Thus, the lessons of Dunkirk ripple outward far beyond 1940. They remind us that leadership is measured not only in bold advances, but in prudent retreats, that endurance is forged in the grit of ordinary men faced with impossible odds, and that survival, even when wrapped in the ashes of retreat, can become the seed of future triumph. In its rawness, its desperation, and its ultimate salvation, Dunkirk remains one of history's great teachers, not of victory, but of survival.